Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where we slow down, sit quietly with the strange and the unexplained, and try to understand the world a little more carefully than the noise of the day usually allows. There is something about the New Mexico desert at night that feels like the edge of everything. Not in a frightening way exactly, but in the way that vast open spaces sometimes do, like the world has run out of distractions and left you alone with the sky. Out there, 75 years ago and more, the land was even quieter. No light pollution worth mentioning, no distant highway hum, just the dry, warm air, the occasional sound of wind moving through scrubland, and above it all, a darkness so complete that the stars looked close enough to touch. It was the kind of place where, if something moved in the sky, you would notice it. And in the summer of 1947, something did. Tonight we're going to spend some time with one of the most debated, most studied, most mythologized and most genuinely puzzling events in modern American history. Not because we are going to solve it. We are not. And anyone who tells you they have is selling something. But because the story of what happened near Roswell, New Mexico in early July of 1947 is worth telling carefully, worth slowing down with, worth looking at honestly, piece by piece, without the noise that usually surrounds it. Something fell from the sky that summer. That much is not in dispute. What it was, who found it, what the military did with it, and why the official explanations never quite lined up. Those are the questions that have kept this story alive for nearly 8 decades. And tonight, we are going to walk through all of it as carefully and as honestly as we can. But before we go anywhere, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you in bed with the lights off, somewhere in the middle of the night, the room quiet around you? Are you driving home through the dark, the road ahead lit by headlights, and not much else? Maybe you're somewhere warm, a window cracked open, the sounds of evening coming in softly. Whatever the answer is, I hope you are comfortable. I hope wherever you are, there is a little stillness around you. Because this is the kind of story that deserves to be heard slowly. If you enjoy this kind of long, careful, atmospheric storytelling, I would genuinely love it if you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might think, and it means we can keep making these. No pressure at all. Just know that it matters. Now, let us go back to the summer of 1947. The war had been over for less than 2 years. The world that emerged from it was not exactly peaceful. It was more like a world that had stopped one kind of fear and immediately started another. The Soviet Union had gone from being an ally to something much harder to name. The atomic bomb existed now, and everyone knew it, and the knowledge of it sat in the background of ordinary life, like a low hum you could not quite locate. America was watchful. The government was watchful. The military was watchful. And the sky had become something people looked at differently than they had before. In that atmosphere, the summer of 1947 was already unusual before anything fell near Roswell. On June 24, 1947, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state when he reported seeing 9 objects moving at extraordinary speed in a formation unlike any aircraft he recognized. He described their motion to a reporter as like a saucer skipping across water. The reporter turned that into the phrase flying saucer, and it stuck immediately. Within days, reports of similar objects were coming in from across the country. The term entered the language almost overnight. People were looking up. So when something came down from that sky, just 9 days after Arnold's sighting, near a remote stretch of land in southeastern New Mexico, it landed, if that is the right word, into a country that was already primed to wonder what was up there. The night in question was July 2nd into the early hours of July 3rd, 1947. There had been a storm. Witnesses in the area reported unusually loud thunder, and at least one account describes a bright flash, or streak of light moving across the sky. The area around Roswell was no stranger to storms in early July, and one more night of thunder would not normally be worth remembering. But the morning after that storm, something had changed on the land, and it would take a few more days before anyone who mattered would know about it. The town of Roswell itself was not a large place, a small city in the Pecos Valley, known for farming, ranching, and the presence of the Roswell Army Airfield on its southern edge. That base was home to the 509th Bomb Group, which was, at that exact moment in history, the only military unit in the world capable of delivering an atomic bomb, the only one. The war had made Roswell strategically significant in a way that most small American towns simply were not. The people who worked at that base were used to keeping things quiet. They were trained for it. The land north of Roswell, out toward the town of Corona, was ranch country. Wide, open, dry. The kind of place where you can drive for an hour and not see another person. The Foster Ranch sat about 75 miles north of Roswell, and it was managed by a rancher named W.W. Brazel, known to nearly everyone as Mac. He lived out there with a kind of practical self-sufficiency that was common to that part of the country. Not isolated in a dramatic sense, just far from things, the way ranch life tends to be. It was Mac Brazel who would find the debris, but not right away. He would not find it until July 7th, and by then whatever had fallen had been sitting on his land for several days. The delay matters, actually, because it tells you something about the rhythms of that life. You do not ride out to every corner of your land every morning. You have sheep to check, fences to mend, work to do. The desert keeps its own schedule. When Brazel did ride out that morning and came across what was scattered across the scrubland, he stopped. He looked at it for a while, and then he went and got his neighbours. What he found, and what he described to people in the days that followed, was not wreckage in any dramatic sense. It was not a smoking crater or a broken machine. It was more like a field of scattered material. Strange foil-like pieces, sticks or beams of some kind, very light. Some kind of tape with markings on it, described by some accounts as flower-like symbols or geometric designs. The material was spread across a wide area, maybe 3/4 of a mile long and a few 100 feet wide. Some of it was so thin and light that it barely seemed to weigh anything. Some of it, according to Brazel and others who handled it, would not bend or crease the way ordinary foil would. When you crumpled it, it returned to its original shape. Now it is worth pausing here and saying plainly, those descriptions come from human memory, reported days or weeks after the fact, and filtered through decades of retelling. We should hold them carefully. But they are what the witnesses said. And the witnesses said the material was unusual enough to stop a working rancher in his tracks and make him show it to his neighbours before he did anything else. He showed it to Dan and Floyd Proctor, neighbours who lived nearby. They looked at it. They were not sure what to make of it either. And then, for a few days, nothing happened. Brazel went back to his work. The debris sat in the field. On July 7th, he drove into the nearby town of Corona and heard people talking about flying saucers. The Kenneth Arnold story had been circulating for 2 weeks by then, and it was the kind of thing people were discussing at the general store and the diner. Something connected in his mind. He drove into Roswell the next day, July 8th, and went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff George Wilcox listened to what Brazel described. He was not sure what to do with it exactly, but he knew who to call. He contacted Roswell Army Airfield, and that is when the military got involved. And once the military got involved, the story stopped being simple. What is striking, when you look at the first few days of this incident, is how ordinary it all seemed at the start. A rancher finds something strange. He tells his neighbours. He reports it to the local sheriff. The sheriff calls the base. These are not the actions of people caught up in something dramatic. They are the actions of practical people doing the practical thing. There is no hysteria in those first steps. Just a man who found something he could not identify, doing what you would do. But the response that came from the base was not ordinary, and the events of the next 24 hours, July 8th, in 1947, would produce a press release that went out over the Associated Press wire to newspapers across the country, and then a retraction of that press release within hours, and then decades of questions that have never been fully answered. It is worth thinking about why Roswell, specifically, became the story that never went away. In 1947, there were hundreds of reported UFO sightings across the United States. The Arnold sighting, reports from pilots, reports from civilians. The Air Force was actively collecting them under a program that would eventually become Project Sign. Most of those reports faded. Most of them were explained or simply forgotten, or left in a file somewhere. Roswell did not fade, and the reason it did not fade is not just because something fell out of the sky. It is because the military picked it up, issued a statement saying what it was, and then immediately said something completely different. That sequence, the announcement and the retraction, the press release and the correction, all within a single day, is what planted the seed that never stopped growing. If the Air Force had simply said, from the beginning, that they had recovered a weather balloon or a piece of experimental equipment, the story might have ended there. People would have been mildly curious, mildly disappointed, and moved on. But that is not what happened. What happened was that the United States military told the press it had recovered a flying disc and then took it back. And once you do that, you do not get to tell people to stop asking questions. There is something deeply human about that dynamic. We can accept a boring explanation if we're given it first. We have much more trouble accepting it when it comes after something more interesting. The sequence matters. The order of information matters. And in July of 1947, the order of information was, to put it gently, not ideal for the people who wanted the story to go away. It did not go away. It has not gone away in 77 years. And tonight, we're going to spend some time understanding why. Not by speculating wildly, not by insisting on any particular answer, but by walking through what actually happened, who was actually there, and what the evidence actually shows. There is a version of this story that is about alien spacecraft and government cover-ups and recovered bodies in secret hangars. You have probably heard that version. It is dramatic. Some of it is fascinating. Some of it is almost certainly not true. And there is another version that is about classified military programs, Cold War secrecy, aging witnesses, cultural mythology, and the very human difficulty of knowing what really happened when the people who were there are gone, the records are incomplete, and the story has been told and retold so many times that the original shape of it is hard to find. Both versions have something real in them, and the truth, as it usually does, lives somewhere in the complicated space between. We will start where it actually started, not with the military, not with the press release, but with a rancher riding out across dry New Mexico scrubland on a July morning, finding something he did not recognize, and stopping his horse to look at it more carefully. That is where Roswell begins, and that is where we will begin too. To understand what happened at Roswell in July of 1947, you really do have to understand the year itself, because 1947 was not a normal year in American life. It was a year that felt, to many people living through it, like the ground was still shifting under their feet, like the world had just survived something enormous and was now trying to figure out what came next, while something new and possibly worse was already building on the horizon. The Second World War had ended less than 2 years earlier. The celebrations were still recent enough to feel real, but the relief had already started to curdle into something more uneasy. The Soviet Union, which had been an ally during the war, was now unmistakably an adversary. Eastern Europe was falling behind what Churchill had called an Iron Curtain. The two nations that had emerged from the war as superpowers were watching each other with a wariness that was not yet called the Cold War by most people, but felt like one. And there was the bomb. That was the thing that sat underneath everything in 1947. The United States had used atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. The world knew what those weapons could do, and the question that haunted American military planners, and quietly ordinary Americans too, was how long it would be before the Soviets had one of their own. The answer, as it turned out, was 1949. But in 1947, nobody knew that. They only knew that the technology existed, that it had already been used, and that the next war, if there was one, would not look like the last one. This is the atmosphere in which Roswell happened. Not a peaceful, optimistic post-war America, but a watchful one. A nervous one. A country that had learned fairly recently that the sky could deliver catastrophe. The institutional landscape of 1947 was also changing in ways that are relevant to this story. In July of 1947, Congress passed the National Security Act, which was signed by President Truman on July 26th, just weeks after the Roswell incident. That act created the Central Intelligence Agency, which officially came into existence in September 1947. It also unified the military branches under a new Department of Defense and, critically, established the United States Air Force as a separate and independent branch of the military. Before September 1947, there was no United States Air Force. There was an Army Air Forces. The transition was already underway during the summer of that year, and it meant that the military was in the middle of a significant reorganization at the exact moment the Roswell incident occurred. New chains of command, new institutional identities, new reasons to keep things compartmentalized. There is something worth sitting with there. The organization that would eventually be responsible for explaining Roswell did not fully exist yet when Roswell happened. The Air Force that issued reports in 1994 and 1997 was, in a real sense, a different institution from the Army Air Forces that was operating in New Mexico in July of 1947. That does not make the later explanations wrong, but it is a reminder that the institutional memory connecting 1947 to the present is not as clean or continuous as official reports sometimes suggest. And then there is Kenneth Arnold. If you have spent any time reading about UFO history, you know this name. On June 24th, 1947, just 2 weeks before Mac Brazel found the debris on the Foster Ranch, Arnold was a private pilot flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state when he observed 9 unusual objects moving at high speed in formation. He described their motion as like a saucer skipping across water. A reporter covering the story used the phrase flying saucers, and that phrase entered the American vocabulary almost overnight. By the time Brazel drove into Corona on July 7th and heard people talking about flying saucers at the general store, the term was only 13 days old, but it had already spread across the country. It was already the thing people were discussing. Arnold's sighting was not the first UFO report in American history, but it was the one that created the language, and the language mattered. Once people had a phrase for what they were seeing, or what they imagined they might be seeing, reports started coming in from across the country. Hundreds of them, through the summer of 1947. The Army Air Forces was actively collecting them, trying to figure out what was going on. Some of those reports were almost certainly misidentifications of conventional aircraft or atmospheric phenomena. Some were fabrications, some were genuinely unexplained. The point is that the cultural context in June and July of 1947 was one of heightened attention to the sky and a shared vocabulary for describing unusual things in it. So when Mac Brazel found his debris field and drove to the sheriff's office, he was not doing so in a vacuum. He was doing so in a country that had been reading about flying saucers for 2 weeks, that was anxious about Soviet capabilities, that was watching the sky with a new kind of wariness. That context does not tell us what the debris was, but it tells us something about how quickly the story moved and why it moved the way it did. Now, Roswell Army Airfield, this is the part that tends to get overlooked in the more dramatic versions of the story, but it is genuinely important. RAAF was not a typical military installation. By the summer of 1947, it was home to the 509th Bomb Group, and the 509th Bomb Group was, at that moment, the only unit in the entire world with the training, the aircraft, and the authorization to deliver atomic weapons. They were the group that had dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were the atomic strike force of the United States military, and they were stationed in the high desert of southeastern New Mexico about 8 miles south of the town of Roswell. That is worth thinking about for a moment. The most sensitive military unit in the world, in terms of nuclear capability, was operating out of a relatively small base in a sparsely populated part of New Mexico. The 509th trained constantly. They maintained their readiness, and they kept their operations extremely close. The intelligence apparatus at RAAF was not casual. The people running security and information at that base were accustomed to keeping things quiet. That was the job. That was the culture. When something unusual happened near Roswell in July of 1947, it did not fall into the hands of an ordinary base with ordinary habits around information. It fell into the hands of the most security-conscious military unit in the United States. Whatever that debris was, and we will get into the competing explanations in some detail, it landed in every sense in exactly the wrong place for anyone who wanted the story to remain simple. The base commander at the time was Colonel William Blanchard. He was a highly regarded officer, later promoted to 4-star general, and he would eventually become Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force before his death in 1966. Blanchard was not a reckless man or a careless one. He was the kind of officer who understood both operational security and public relations, which makes what he authorized on July 8, 1947. The press release describing the recovery of a flying disc, one of the more puzzling decisions in this entire story. We will come back to that. The intelligence officer Blanchard sent to investigate Mac Brazel's report was Major Jesse Marcel. Marcel was a 32-year-old from Louisiana, a World War II veteran who had served as an intelligence officer throughout the war. He was by most accounts a competent and experienced officer. He had a wife, Vude, and a 12-year-old son named Jesse Marcel Jr. He lived in Roswell. He knew the area. And when the call came in from Sheriff Wilcox about a rancher who had found something strange out on the Foster Ranch, it was Marcel who was sent to look at it. Marcel's role in this story is layered. In 1947, he was a military officer following orders, collecting material, and reporting up the chain. In 1978, he was a retired man in his early 60s who agreed to be interviewed by a nuclear physicist named Stanton Friedman, who was researching UFO cases, and what Marcel said in that interview, and in subsequent interviews before his death in 1986, was that the material he collected at the Foster Ranch was not a weather balloon. It was not anything he could identify, and the material that appeared in the photographs taken at General Ramey's office in Fort Worth, which the Air Force said was the recovered debris, was not the same material he had brought in from the ranch. That is a significant claim. We will look at it carefully when we get to Marcel's testimony in detail. For now, it is enough to note that Marcel was there. He was the intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group. He had handled military equipment for years, and he said repeatedly that what he found was not standard military equipment. That claim is the thread that runs through the entire Roswell story, and it starts with a man who had every professional reason to accept a simple explanation and chose, late in his life, not to. There is one more piece of 1947 context that matters, and it is easy to miss if you are focused on the UFO angle. The United States military in 1947 was running a number of highly classified programs that most people, including most members of Congress, knew nothing about. The nuclear program was the most obvious one, but there were others: balloon programs, acoustic monitoring programs, high-altitude research. Some of these programs were so compartmentalized that personnel at one base might have no idea what personnel at another base were doing, even if the two bases were relatively close to each other. This is the environment in which Project Mogul was operating. We will spend real time on Mogul later in this story, because it is the most credible alternative explanation for what fell on the Foster Ranch. But for now, the relevant point is simply this. In 1947, the United States military was doing things in the New Mexico desert that it did not want anyone to know about. Not because those things were sinister, but because the Cold War was beginning, and the Soviets were watching, and secrecy was the default setting for almost everything that touched national security. That habit of secrecy, institutional, reflexive, deeply ingrained, is part of what made Roswell possible. Not the crash, or whatever it was, but the mystery. The secrecy culture of 1947 America meant that when the military said weather balloon and moved on, a significant number of people simply did not believe them. Not because those people were paranoid, but because they knew in a general way that the military kept secrets. That was not a conspiracy theory in 1947. That was recent lived experience. The Manhattan Project had been kept from the American public for years. If the government could hide the development of the atomic bomb, it could certainly hide a weather balloon program. The culture of the country and the culture of the military were, in 1947, almost perfectly arranged to produce exactly the kind of mystery that Roswell became. A nervous public, a secretive military, a new vocabulary for unusual things in the sky, a base with extraordinary capabilities and extraordinary habits around information, a debris field in a remote stretch of desert, a press release that said one thing and a correction that said another. These are not random elements. They fit together in a way that made the story almost inevitable once it started. And it is worth saying clearly, none of this proves that what fell near Roswell was extraterrestrial. The context explains the mystery. It does not solve it. What the context does is help us understand why a story that might have lasted 3 days in the newspapers instead lasted 3/4 of a century and is still being discussed tonight in whatever room or car or quiet space you happen to be in right now. The summer of 1947 was, in many ways, the founding moment of the modern UFO era in America. Kenneth Arnold's sighting created the language. The wave of sightings that followed created the cultural conversation. And Roswell, with its military base, its press release, its retraction, and its debris field, gave that conversation something concrete to hold on to. A specific place, a specific date, specific people with names and ranks and addresses, something that could be investigated, argued over, returned to again and again. The other sightings of 1947 faded because they were, ultimately, just stories. Roswell had a paper trail. It had a press release. It had photographs. It had a rancher, a sheriff, a major, a general, a colonel. It had institutions involved, which meant it had the possibility of accountability. And that possibility, even when the accountability never quite arrived, kept people looking. By the time Mac Brazel walked into Sheriff Wilcox's office on July 7th, 1947, the world around him had already spent 2 weeks getting ready to care about exactly this kind of thing. He did not know that. He was just a rancher with a truck and a problem he did not know how to classify. But the story he was about to set in motion would outlast him, outlast everyone who was there, and outlast most of the institutions that tried to explain it. And it all began, in the most practical possible way, with a man on horseback riding out to check on his sheep, which is exactly where we need to go next. The Foster Ranch sits in Lincoln County, New Mexico, about 75 miles north of Roswell. If you've never been to that part of the state, it is difficult to fully picture how remote it actually is. The land is high desert plateau, mostly flat, cut through occasionally by dry arroyos and low ridges. The grass is sparse and tough. The sky is enormous. In summer, thunderstorms roll in from the southwest in the late afternoon and can be violent. Lightning, hard rain, sometimes hail. And then they pass and the air goes quiet again and the stars come out, and there is almost no sound at all. McBrazel had worked ranches in that country for most of his adult life. He was used to the silence and the weather and the long distances between things. But Brazel, everyone called him Mac, was the foreman of the Foster Ranch, which was owned by a man named J.B. Foster. Brazel lived on the property with his family, though in the summer of 1947 his wife and children were staying elsewhere, and he had a young neighbour boy named Dee Proctor staying with him to help with the work. The ranch covered a large area, and part of Brazel's regular routine was riding out to check on the sheep, making sure they were where they were supposed to be, making sure the fences were intact. On the night of July 2nd into July 3rd, 1947, there was a significant storm over that part of New Mexico. Several people in the area later recalled hearing a loud explosion or a sharp crack during the storm, something that stood out from the ordinary thunder. Whether that sound was connected to what Brazel found the next morning is one of those details that has been debated for decades without resolution. What is agreed upon is that sometime around July 4th or July 5th, the exact date is not certain, Mac Brazel rode out across the ranch and came across something he had not seen before. Spread across a stretch of ground roughly 3/4 of a mile long and several hundred feet wide was a field of debris. Not a single large object, not a crater, just debris, scattered across the scrubby grass and dirt as if something had come apart in the air above and rained down in pieces. Brazel dismounted and walked through it, picking up pieces, turning them over in his hands. What he described later, both to neighbours and to reporters, was a collection of materials unlike anything he recognised from ordinary ranch life. There were strips of what he called tinfoil, though it was not quite like ordinary foil. It was thinner, lighter, and when you crumpled it, it would smooth itself back out. There were what he described as sticks or beams, slender and light, made of something that felt like balsa wood but was harder to break. There were scraps of what seemed like thick paper or parchment. There was some kind of tape, dark in colour, with a pattern on it that some accounts describe as flower-like symbols or geometric designs. And there were small pieces of something darker, more brittle, that did not fit neatly into any of those categories. The debris was spread widely enough that it clearly covered a significant area, but none of the individual pieces were especially large. Brazel gathered some of it up, enough to carry, and took it back toward the ranch house. He showed some of what he had found to his neighbours, Floyd and Loretta Proctor, who lived nearby. Loretta Proctor later recalled that Brazel brought a piece of the material over and they all looked at it and tried to figure out what it was. She said it was not like anything she had seen. She said it was very light and that it would not burn when Floyd held a match to it. They could not identify it. They suggested to Brazel that he might want to report it to someone. And here is one of the genuinely interesting details of the early Roswell story. One that tends to get glossed over in the more dramatic retellings. McBrazel did not immediately go to the authorities. He waited. Several days passed. The exact number varies depending on the account, but most place it at somewhere between 2 and 5 days. Before Brazel drove into Roswell and reported what he had found. Why the delay? Brazel himself, when he spoke to reporters later, gave a fairly practical answer. He said he had work to do. The ranch did not stop needing attention because there was strange debris in one of the pastures. He also said, in at least one account, that he was not entirely sure it was worth making a fuss about. He had found odd things on the ranch before. Pieces of weather balloons, fragments of equipment, the occasional bit of debris that drifted in from who knows where. The New Mexico desert was not a tidy place. Things turned up. But there was also, by some accounts, another factor. By early July 1947, the flying saucer story had been in the newspapers for about 2 weeks. Kenneth Arnold's sighting had run in papers across the country in late June, and there had been a wave of subsequent reports. It is possible that Brazel made some connection, however vague, between what he had found and what people were talking about in the news. His son, Bill Brazel Jr., later said that his father had heard the flying disc reports on the radio, and that this may have been part of what finally pushed him to go into town. That detail is not confirmed, but it is plausible. On July 7th, 1947, Mac Brazel drove into Roswell and went to the office of Sheriff George Wilcox. He told Wilcox what he had found. He may have brought some of the debris with him. Accounts differ on this point. Wilcox listened, and he took it seriously enough to make a phone call. He contacted Roswell Army Airfield and reported what the rancher had described. Wilcox himself was a practical man, a county sheriff with a working relationship with the base. The 509th Bomb Group was the largest employer in the area, and the military and the local community were on generally good terms. calling the base about something unusual that had turned up in the desert was a reasonable, straightforward thing to do. There was nothing dramatic about it, at least not yet. It was just a sheriff making a phone call. The base took the call seriously, and this is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is one of the things that distinguishes the Roswell incident from the hundreds of other flying saucer reports that were coming in across the country in June and July of 1947. Most of those reports were handled by local police or newspaper offices, or in some cases by military offices that filed a report and moved on. The RF did not move on. Within hours of Wilcox's call, personnel from the base were in contact with Brazel, and arrangements were being made to go out to the ranch and look at the debris field in person. There is a question embedded in that response that is worth sitting with. Why did the 509th Bomb Group, the most elite, most secretive military unit in the United States at that moment, treat a rancher's debris report as something requiring an immediate in-person investigation by its intelligence officer? One explanation is simply institutional caution. In 1947, with Soviet espionage a real and active concern, any unidentified material found near a classified installation was worth checking out. Another explanation is that someone at the base already had reason to believe this was not an ordinary piece of debris. Those two explanations are not mutually exclusive, and the answer, if there is one, is somewhere in what happened next. Brazel went back to the ranch that day, and he was accompanied, or followed shortly after, by two men from the base. One of them was Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer of the 509th. The other was Captain Sheridan Cavett, who was with the Counterintelligence Corps, which is its own interesting detail because the CIC was not an ordinary military unit. It was the military's internal security and counterintelligence service. Sending a CIC officer to look at ranch debris was not a standard response to a weather balloon report. Marcel and Cavett drove out to the Foster Ranch that evening. The ranch was a significant distance from Roswell, about 75 miles, over roads that were not particularly good in 1947. So by the time they arrived, it was getting late. Marcel spent the night at the ranch. The following morning, July 8th, he went out to the debris field with Brazel. What Marcel saw and handled that morning became the centre of one of the most contested testimonies in the entire Roswell story. He spent time in the debris field, examining the material, collecting pieces. He later described in interviews given in the late 1970s and early 1980s what he found. He said the foil-like material was extraordinarily thin but could not be dented or creased. If you crumpled it, it would return to its original shape. He said the beam-like pieces were very light and had markings on them, symbols of some kind that he could not read and that did not resemble any language or code he was familiar with. He said there was so much of it that it took some time to gather even a portion of it up. Marcel also said, clearly and consistently in his later interviews, that he had handled a great deal of military equipment over the years, and that what he found on the Foster Ranch was not any of it. Not a weather balloon, not a radar reflector, not any aircraft component he could identify. He was, he said, certain of this. Now, it is important to be honest about the weight of that testimony. Marcel was speaking 30 years after the fact in interviews conducted by UFO researchers who were to varying degrees interested in a particular conclusion. Memory is not a recording. 30 years of living with a story, of reading about it, of being asked about it, can reshape what a person believes they remember. That is not an accusation against Marcel. It is just how human memory works, and it applies to everyone in this story. But it is also true that Marcel had specific professional credentials that give his account a certain weight. He was not a casual observer. He was an intelligence officer whose job involved, among other things, identifying unusual equipment and assessing potential threats. When he said something was not a weather balloon, he was speaking from a professional baseline that most people did not have. Before Marcel drove back to Roswell with the debris he had collected, he made a stop that has become one of the more humanly interesting details in the whole story. He stopped at his home. It was early morning before dawn, and he woke up his wife and his son, 11-year-old Jesse Marcel Jr., and he showed them some of the material he had brought from the ranch. He spread pieces of it out on the kitchen floor. Jesse Marcel Jr. later described this moment in detail. He was a physician by the time he gave most of his interviews, and later a military doctor who served in Iraq, and he spoke about that morning on the kitchen floor with a calm specificity that is hard to dismiss. He said he held pieces of the foil-like material, and that it was unlike anything he had felt before. He described the I-beam pieces with the markings on them. He said, like his father, that he did not know what it was. Jesse Marcel Jr. maintained that account for the rest of his life. He wrote a book about it. He gave interviews. He testified before the Citizen, hearing on disclosure in Washington in 2013 when he was in his 70s. He died in 2013, not long after that testimony. Whatever he was describing, whether it was something truly extraordinary or something that had been filtered and reshaped by decades of family storytelling, he described it the same way, with the same details, every time. Marcel Sr. then continued to Roswell Army Airfield, where the debris was taken to the base. And it was from the base, on the morning of July 8th, 1947, that everything accelerated in a way that nobody, not Brazel, not Marcel, not Sheriff Wilcox, had quite anticipated. Because that morning the Public Information Officer at RAAF issued a press release, and for about 6 hours the United States military told the world it had recovered a flying disc. What happened in those 6 hours, and what happened immediately after them, is where the Roswell story stops being a rancher's debris report and becomes something else entirely. The press release, the retraction, the photographs in Fort Worth and the explanation that followed, all of that happened in a single day, July 8th, 1947, and it set the terms of the debate for everything that came after. To understand why so many people never accepted the official explanation, you have to understand exactly what the military said, and when they said it, and how quickly they changed their story. That is where we are headed next. So let us go back to the morning of July 8th, 1947. It is a Tuesday. The summer heat in New Mexico is already building by mid-morning, and at Roswell Army Airfield, something is happening that is, by any measure, unusual. The debris from the Foster Ranch has arrived at the base. Colonel William Blanchard, the commanding officer of the 509th Bomb Group, has been briefed, and at some point that morning, Blanchard makes a decision that would echo for the next 7 decades. He authorises his Public Information Officer, First Lieutenant Walter Haut, to issue a press release. Walter Haut was 24 years old. He had served as a bombardier during the war, which was how he ended up at Roswell. The 509th was the unit, and Roswell was the base, and Haut was part of the administrative structure that kept it running. His job as Public Information Officer was to handle press inquiries, issue statements, manage the base's relationship with local media. It was not a glamorous role, but it was an important one. And on the morning of July 8th, following Blanchard's instructions, Haut typed up a press release and drove it into town, delivering copies to the 2 local radio stations and the 2 local newspapers. The press release was short. It read, in its essential content, that the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, had been fortunate enough to gain possession of a flying disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the Sheriff's Office of Chaves County. It stated that the disc had been located on a ranch in the Roswell vicinity, and that it was being flown to higher headquarters. That was essentially it. No description of what the disc looked like, no speculation about its origin. Just a flat, matter-of-fact statement from a United States Army Air Forces base, saying that they had recovered a flying disc. It is worth pausing on that for a moment, because the language is genuinely striking. Not a weather balloon, not an unidentified object, not an aircraft of unknown type, a flying disc. That specific phrase, the same phrase that had been in the newspapers following Kenneth Arnold's sighting 2 weeks earlier, the phrase that was already circulating in the public imagination, was the phrase the military chose to use. Whether that was intentional, careless, or simply the most accurate word available to whoever wrote the release is something that has never been fully explained. The story moved fast. The Associated Press picked it up. By early afternoon on July 8th, newspapers across the country were running it. The headlines were not subtle. The Roswell Daily Record ran the story under a headline that said the RAAF had captured a flying saucer. Papers in Chicago, in San Francisco, in London picked it up. Radio stations broadcast it. For a few hours on that Tuesday afternoon, the United States military had apparently confirmed that something extraordinary had been recovered from the New Mexico desert. And then, roughly 6 hours after the press release went out, everything changed. Brigadier General Roger Ramey was the commanding general of the 8th Air Force, based at Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas. He was Blanchard's superior. At some point on July 8th, and the exact sequence of events is not entirely clear, Ramey intervened. He ordered that the debris be flown to Fort Worth. He called a press conference, and he issued a correction to the story that had been running all day across the country. What the Army had actually recovered, Ramey said, was a weather balloon, specifically a Rowan target device, a type of radar reflector used in conjunction with high-altitude weather balloons to allow ground crews to track the balloon's position and movement. The Rowan device was made of foil and balsa wood, attached to a standard weather balloon, and it was fairly common equipment at military installations in 1947. Ramey said the debris had been misidentified by people who were not familiar with this type of equipment, and that once it reached Fort Worth and was examined by someone who knew what they were looking at, the identification was straightforward. To underscore the point, photographs were taken. Jesse Marcel was present at Fort Worth, and he was photographed kneeling on the floor of Ramey's office, beside pieces of debris. In the photographs, the material looks like crumpled foil and rubber, with what appears to be the remains of a balloon visible. Ramey's weather officer, Warrant Officer Irving Newton, was brought in to identify the material, and he confirmed it was a Rowan target device. He said he recognized it immediately, that he had worked with them many times. Newton was consistent in that identification for the rest of his life. He said plainly that what he saw in Ramey's office was a weather balloon and radar reflector, nothing more. The newspapers updated their stories. Some ran follow-up headlines noting the correction. Within a day or two, most of the national press had moved on. There were other things happening in the summer of 1947. The Cold War was accelerating, there were labour disputes, there was a heat wave across the East Coast. A weather balloon in New Mexico was not a story that demanded sustained attention. The Army had explained it. The photographs existed. The case was, officially, closed, and for about 30 years it largely stayed that way. But there is a detail in that sequence of events that has bothered people ever since, and it is worth sitting with it carefully, because it does not have a clean answer. The detail is this: Jesse Marcel, an experienced intelligence officer whose specific job involved assessing unusual materials and potential threats, examined the debris on the Foster Ranch and apparently did not recognize it as a Rowan weather balloon device. Yet Irving Newton, brought in at Fort Worth, recognized it immediately. That gap between Marcel's claimed confusion and Newton's immediate certainty is one of the things that has kept the debate alive. There are reasonable explanations for it. Marcel may have been unfamiliar with Rowan devices specifically, even if he had general familiarity with weather balloons. The debris field on the ranch was scattered over a large area, and fragments of a Rowan device separated from its balloon and damaged by impact might look quite different from an intact unit. It is also possible that Marcel, speaking 30 years later, unconsciously shaped his recollection to fit a story that had grown around him. Memory does that. It is not dishonesty. It is just how memory works under the weight of time and repetition. But Marcel himself, in his later interviews, addressed this directly. He said he knew what weather balloons looked like. He said he had been involved in recovering weather balloons before. He said what he found on the Foster Ranch was not that. He was calm about it. He was not dramatic or excitable in the interviews. He came across, by most accounts, as a measured, thoughtful man who was simply describing what he remembered. He also said something that tends to get less attention than his descriptions of the material. He said that what was photographed in General Ramey's office was not what he had brought from the ranch. He said the material in the photographs was not the debris he'd collected. Someone had substituted it. That is a significant claim. If true, it suggests a deliberate act of deception at a fairly high level of the military chain of command. If false, or if Marcel's memory was simply wrong, it is a detail that has no documentary support either way, because the original debris, whatever it was never publicly accounted for after Fort Worth. The photographs themselves have been the subject of considerable analysis over the decades. In the 1990s, researchers using enhanced imaging on high-resolution scans of the original photographs claimed to identify text on a piece of paper that General Ramey is holding in one of the images. The claimed text, which has been disputed by other analysts, appeared to reference a disc and victims of the wreck. The Air Force and most mainstream analysts have not accepted this reading as reliable, and the resolution of the original photographs makes any definitive interpretation difficult. But the attempt reflects how seriously some researchers have taken the possibility that what was photographed in Fort Worth was not what was recovered from the ranch. General Ramey himself never gave a detailed public account of his thinking on July 8th. He held the press conference, he provided the weather balloon explanation, and he moved on. He died in 1963 before the Roswell story had any real public traction, so he was never interviewed by researchers or journalists in the way that Marcel and Out and others were later in their lives. What Ramey actually knew, and what decisions he made and why, is not something the record can tell us clearly. Colonel Blanchard, who authorised the original press release, is another figure whose inner reasoning remains opaque. He was a highly regarded officer. He eventually rose to 4-star general and was serving as Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force when he died suddenly of a heart attack in 1966. People who knew him described him as sharp, careful, and not given to careless decisions, which raises a question that has no obvious answer. Why would a careful, experienced commanding officer authorise a press release describing a flying disc if what had been brought to his base was a weather balloon? Was he genuinely mistaken about what he had? Was he acting on incomplete information from Marcel? Or was something else happening? Some researchers have suggested that Blanchard may have genuinely believed, at the time he authorised the press release, that something significant had been recovered, and that the correction from Fort Worth represented not a clarification, but a cover story imposed from above. Others have argued that the simpler explanation is more likely, that Blanchard was working from Marcel's field assessment, which was wrong, and that the correction came when someone with more relevant expertise looked at the material. That is a reasonable position. It does not require any deception. It just requires Marcel to have been mistaken. What makes it hard to settle is the speed and the specificity. The press release was not vague. It said flying disc. The retraction was not tentative. It said weather balloon. Both came from the same military installation within the same day. And the man who wrote the original press release, Walter Haut, spent the rest of his life in Roswell. He co-founded the International UFO Museum there. He gave interviews. He was part of the community that kept the Roswell story alive, and his own relationship to what he had written in 1947, what he believed about it, what he knew about it, is something we will return to later in this story, because it gets considerably more complicated. For now, though, it is enough to understand what July 8th, 1947 looked like from the outside. In the span of a single afternoon, the United States military told the American public it had recovered a flying disc, and then told them it had not. The explanation offered, a weather balloon with a radar reflector, was technically plausible and was confirmed by a weather officer on the scene. The photographs existed. The official account was consistent and was not seriously challenged in public at the time. But the people who had actually been at the Foster Ranch, Brazel, Marcel, and to a lesser extent Cavett, were left with their own memories of what they had seen and handled. And those memories, whatever they actually contained, did not disappear just because a general in Fort Worth held a press conference. Brazel himself appears to have been affected by the experience in ways that are hard to fully trace. After the military got involved, he was reportedly held at the base for several days. The exact circumstances are unclear, and accounts vary. When he gave an interview to the Roswell Daily Record shortly after the weather balloon announcement, he described the debris in fairly ordinary terms, consistent with balloon material. Neighbours and family members later said he seemed changed after that period, more reluctant to talk about what he had found, and that he once told his son he had found something unusual, but that he could not say more about it. Whether that reflects pressure from the military, a simple desire to be done with the whole thing, or something else, nobody can say for certain. The weather balloon explanation closed the story publicly, but it left enough loose threads that the story was never quite finished. The threads just waited. They waited through the late 1940s and the 1950s, through the Cold War and the space race and a dozen other things that occupied the American imagination. They waited until the late 1970s, when a retired intelligence officer named Jesse Marcel sat down for an interview and said, quietly and without drama, that what he had found on that ranch in 1947 was not a weather balloon. That interview, and what grew from it, is a separate chapter in the Roswell story. But to get there, we first need to understand the explanation the Air Force would eventually offer that went well beyond weather balloons. Because in 1994, nearly 50 years after the fact, the government produced a much more detailed accounting of what it believed had come down on the Foster Ranch. And that explanation, called Project Mogul, is the most serious and technically substantive answer to the Roswell question that has ever been officially proposed. But before we get to Mogul, we need to stay with July 8th a little longer, because that single day, that press release, that retraction, those photographs in Fort Worth, is the hinge on which the entire Roswell story turns. Everything that came before it is context. Everything that came after it is consequence. And the events of that Tuesday deserve a careful, unhurried look, because the details matter more than they might first appear. The press release was short. It was less than 200 words. Lieutenant Walter Haut typed it up at Roswell Army Airfield on the morning of July 8th, and it went out over the wire services that afternoon. The key sentence read, "The many rumours regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chaves County." It did not say spacecraft, it did not say alien, it said disc, flying disc. And in the summer of 1947, with Kenneth Arnold's sighting of 9 objects over Mount Rainier still fresh in the public mind, from just 2 weeks earlier, those 2 words carried enormous weight. Haut did not write that release on his own initiative. He was a public information officer, which meant his job was to communicate what the command wanted communicated. He said later, in various interviews over the years, that the release was authorised by Colonel William Blanchard, the base commander. Blanchard told him to put it out, and so he did. That is a straightforward chain of command. The press release was not a mistake or an accident or a junior officer going rogue. It was an authorised communication from one of the most significant military installations in the United States, issued by its commanding officer. The wire services picked it up immediately. The Associated Press distributed it within the hour. By early afternoon on July 8th, newspapers across the country were running with it. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram ran the headline. The Chicago Daily Tribune carried it. Stations in Los Angeles and New York were reporting it on the radio. The story moved the way big stories moved in 1947. Fast, wide, and with very little verification, because the source was the United States Army Air Forces itself, which was about as authoritative a source as existed. If the military said they had a flying disc, people believed the military had a flying disc, and then, within hours, it was gone. Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commanding the 8th Air Force from his headquarters at Carswell Army Airfield in Fort Worth, Texas, called a press conference. He had the material that Marcel had brought from the ranch laid out on the floor of his office. Photographers were allowed in, Marcel was present, and Ramey identified what was on the floor as the remains of a Rowan target device, a radar reflector used in conjunction with weather balloons. He had his weather officer, Warrant Officer Irving Newton, confirm the identification. Newton later said he recognised it immediately as standard equipment he had worked with many times. Ramey told the press the whole thing was a misidentification. The Army had recovered a weather balloon with a radar target. Nothing more. The photographs taken in Ramey's office that day still exist. They show foil material and what appears to be rubber spread across the floor, with Marcel crouching nearby. In some photographs, Ramey is holding what looks like a telegram or document, though the text in that document has been the subject of considerable analysis over the decades. Some researchers have claimed to read words like victims and disc in the blurred text, though the image quality makes any definitive reading impossible. The photographs themselves became part of the debate. Were they showing the actual material from the Foster Ranch, or had the material been switched before the cameras arrived? That last question is the one Jesse Marcel would eventually raise. But in July 1947, Marcel said nothing publicly. He was a military officer. He followed orders. He stood in Ramey's office while the weather balloon explanation was delivered to the press, and he did not contradict it. Whatever he thought privately, he kept it to himself for more than 30 years. The newspapers that had run the flying disc headline moved on almost immediately. The correction was clean and official, and came with photographs and an expert identification. There was no prolonged debate in the press. The Roswell Daily Record, which had been one of the first local papers to report the recovery, ran the weather balloon correction on the same day. Within 48 hours, the story had essentially disappeared from national coverage. The summer of 1947 had plenty of other things to pay attention to. The Cold War was accelerating. The Marshall Plan was being debated. There were other UFO sightings being reported across the country. Dozens of them in the weeks after Arnold's June 24th sighting. Roswell was just one incident, and it had been explained. Most people moved on. What is worth sitting with for a moment is the specific sequence of authority involved. Blanchard authorised the press release. Ramey retracted it. In the military structure of 1947, Ramey outranked Blanchard. Ramey was a brigadier general. Blanchard was a colonel, so the correction came from above. That is not unusual in itself. Commanding officers correct subordinates. But the nature of the correction is what makes it interesting. Blanchard had not said they recovered something unidentified. He had said they recovered a flying disc. That is a specific claim. And Ramey's correction was equally specific. It was a weather balloon. Two specific contradictory claims from two different levels of command within the same day. One explanation, as noted before, is simple. Blanchard was working from Marcel's assessment. Marcel was wrong, and Ramey had access to better information or better expertise. Irving Newton, the weather officer who identified the debris in Ramey's office, was clear and consistent in his account for the rest of his life. He said what he saw was a raw-in target, foil and balsa wood and rubber, and that he had no doubt about it. He found the whole episode a bit bewildering, frankly. He thought it was strange that anyone had been confused by the material in the first place. That is one version of the day. It is coherent. It does not require any extraordinary explanation. It requires Marcel to have been genuinely mistaken about material that a more experienced weather officer recognised immediately. The other version is more complicated, and it is the version that has fueled decades of investigation. In this version, the material in Ramey's office was not the same material Marcel had collected at the Foster Ranch. The switch, if there was one, would have happened somewhere between Roswell and Fort Worth, or possibly in Fort Worth before the photographers arrived. Marcel, in later interviews, said directly that the debris he was photographed with in Ramey's office was not what he had loaded into his car at the ranch. He was careful about this. He did not claim to know what had really been recovered. He just said the material in the photographs was not what he had collected. Tinfoil and rubber from a weather balloon, he said, was not what he remembered handling in the field. The problem is that Marcel's later testimony, as compelling as it is in some ways, cannot be independently verified. He was one person, speaking decades after the fact, about material that no longer exists in any form that can be tested. His son, Jesse Marcel Jr., who was 11 years old in 1947, and who said his father woke him up in the middle of the night to show him the debris before driving to the base, gave consistent accounts throughout his adult life. Jesse Jr. became a physician, served as a flight surgeon in the Montana Army National Guard, was deployed to Iraq, and by any measure was a credible and grounded person. He described holding pieces of material as a child that had strange symbols on them, that were light but seemed unusually strong, and that he had never been able to identify with anything he later encountered. He held to that account until his death in 2013, but again, one witness, childhood memory, 6 decades of elapsed time. What the July 8th press release and its rapid retraction actually demonstrate with certainty is that the United States military issued 2 contradictory official statements about the same event within the same afternoon. That is documented. The press release exists, the correction exists, the photographs exist, the wire service reports exist. Whatever the material actually was, the public communication around it was confused, contradictory, and resolved in a way that left no room for follow-up questions. The story was closed before most people had time to ask any. There is also the question of what happened to Mac Brazel in the days that followed. After Marcel and Cavett visited the ranch and collected debris, Brazel was brought to the base. He stayed there for several days. Accounts differ on exactly how long, with some saying 3 days and others suggesting longer. During that time, he was reportedly interviewed repeatedly. When he re-emerged and gave his interview to the Roswell Daily Record on July 9th, his description of the debris was measured and relatively mundane. He described rubber, tinfoil, paper, tape, and sticks. He said he did not think it had anything to do with weather observation equipment, but he acknowledged it might have been. He mentioned he had found a weather balloon on the ranch once before in 1942, and that what he found this time was not the same. But he said it in a way that did not sound alarmed or conspiratorial. He sounded like a tired rancher who wanted the whole thing to be over. His neighbours noticed a change in him after those days at the base. His son, Bill Brazel Jr., said later that his father was not a man who talked much about personal matters, but that he once mentioned he had been told not to talk about what he had found. Whether that was an official instruction or simply his own reluctance, Bill could not say. Loretta Proctor, the neighbour to whom Brazel had first shown a piece of the debris, said she had the impression he had been pressured to stay quiet. She said the piece he showed her before the military arrived was not anything she recognised, and that it could not be cut or burned. That last detail, material that resisted cutting and burning, appears in several early accounts from people who claim to have handled the debris, and it is one of the details that does not fit neatly with a standard raw-in weather balloon. None of this is proof of anything beyond the ordinary. Witnesses misremember. Details accumulate and shift over time. A rancher under stress for several days might come out of that experience subdued and unwilling to keep talking about something that had already caused him a great deal of inconvenience. The military had every reason to want the story contained quickly, not necessarily because of anything extraordinary, but because in 1947 the Army Air Forces was not in the business of entertaining public speculation about unidentified objects near a nuclear-capable base. Containment was a reasonable institutional response to an embarrassing misidentification, even if nothing more unusual than a balloon had come down. But here is what sits at the centre of all of it, the thing that makes July 8th, 1947 genuinely difficult to simply dismiss. The original press release was not issued by a confused rancher or an excitable local sheriff. It was issued by the intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group, authorized by the commanding officer of the most strategically significant airbase in the United States at that time, and distributed through official military channels. the people who wrote it and approved it were not civilians prone to excitement about flying saucers. They were professional military officers who had spent the war years developing habits of precision and caution. For that press release to have been issued, and then retracted in the same afternoon, something went significantly wrong in the chain of information, whether through honest error or something more deliberate. Which version you find more persuasive probably depends on how much trust you extend to the institutions involved, and that is a question each person has to answer for themselves. What is clear is that the July 8th press release was the moment Roswell became something more than a local curiosity. Before it, there was a rancher with a debris field and a sheriff with a phone call to make. After it, there was a documented, published, wire service distributed claim from the United States military that a flying disc had been recovered. That claim existed, even if it was retracted within hours. It was printed in newspapers, people read it, and even after the correction ran, some of those people never quite let go of the first version. The official story, as of the evening of July 8th, 1947, was settled. A weather balloon with a radar reflector, misidentified by an intelligence officer, corrected by a general, photographed and explained and closed. Most of the country accepted that and moved on. The Roswell incident, as it would come to be called, was not yet an incident in any lasting cultural sense. It was a brief news item, a small embarrassment for one military base, and a story that had already been explained. But the explanation the Air Force offered in 1947, the Rowan target balloon, was not the last official explanation Roswell would receive. Because in 1994, under pressure from a congressional investigation, the Air Force produced a much more detailed and technically substantive account of what it believed had actually fallen on the Foster Ranch. That account involved a classified program, a chain of balloon trains stretching hundreds of feet into the stratosphere, and a mission so secret that even the people working on it were not allowed to discuss it openly. It is called Project Mogul, and it is the most serious scientific and historical answer to the Roswell question that has ever been put forward, and it deserves a careful look of its own. So let us go back to Fort Worth, Texas, on the afternoon of July 8th, 1947, because that is where the official explanation was born, and where, for many people, the questions actually began. Brigadier General Roger Ramey was the commanding general of the 8th Air Force, based at Carswell Army Airfield in Fort Worth. When the Roswell story moved across the AP wire that morning, it moved fast. Ramey was the man who had to contain it. By early afternoon, Major Marcel had flown some of the debris to Fort Worth. A press conference was called, photographers were brought in, and in the photographs taken that day in Ramey's office, you can see Marcel kneeling beside a collection of materials spread across the floor: foil, rubber, what looks like the remains of a balloon, and its attached equipment. Ramey stood nearby. His weather officer, Warrant Officer Irving Newton, identified the debris on the spot as a roll-in target device, a standard piece of equipment used in upper atmosphere weather observation, made of foil-covered balsa wood sticks and attached to a neoprene weather balloon. Newton said he had launched and handled dozens of them. He had no doubt about what he was looking at. The statement went out. The correction was published. The story, as far as the military and most of the press were concerned, was closed. It helps to understand what a Rowan target actually was, because the name sounds technical in a way that can obscure how ordinary the object itself was. A Rowan target device, sometimes called a radar wind target, was a lightweight reflective structure used to track the movement of high-altitude weather balloons by radar. The design was simple: a hexagonal or diamond-shaped frame made of balsa wood sticks, covered with aluminized foil or a similar reflective material, and attached beneath a large neoprene balloon. The whole assembly was designed to return a radar signal, which allowed meteorologists to track wind direction and speed at altitude by watching the target's movement on a radar screen. These devices were in widespread use by the military in 1947. They were not exotic. They were not classified. They were standard equipment, and Irving Newton knew them well. The foil-like material, the sticks, the tape holding the structure together. All of this was consistent with a roll-in target. The material was light, somewhat crinkly, and could look strange to someone who had never handled one before. The balsa wood sticks, when broken or scattered, could seem like unusual rods or beams. The tape used in some versions of the device had printed patterns on it, not exactly flower symbols, but geometric shapes that might be described that way by someone unfamiliar with the equipment. The weather balloon itself, once deflated and torn, would produce large irregular sheets of neoprene rubber that could look like nothing in particular if you had never seen one before. Taken together, this was a plausible and internally consistent explanation. The debris MacBrazel found could have been a Rowan balloon assembly. The material, scattered over a wide area after the balloon burst at altitude, could have produced exactly the kind of strange, unfamiliar debris field he described. And in 1947, most civilians in rural New Mexico would not have had much reason to be familiar with military meteorological equipment. A raw wind target landing on your ranch would look genuinely odd. It would not look like a weather balloon in the way most people imagine one. For the majority of the country, this was enough. The explanation was technical, specific, and delivered by a credentialed military officer with direct experience of the equipment in question. Newspapers that had run the flying disc headline that morning ran the correction that afternoon or the next day. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram, which had been among the first to carry Ramey's statement, moved on to other stories within days. Roswell faded from the national conversation almost as quickly as it had appeared. It was a brief, slightly embarrassing moment for one Air Force base, explained, corrected, and filed away. But Jesse Marcel did not agree with what was photographed in Ramey's office. This is the part of the official explanation that has never been fully resolved, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment rather than rushing past it. Marcel was the man who had collected the debris from the Foster Ranch. He had spent time at the site. He had handled the material. He had loaded it into his car, driven it home, shown it to his wife and his young son, and then taken it to the base. He had more direct physical contact with the Roswell debris than almost anyone else in the official record. And in interviews he gave decades later, after he had retired, after he had nothing obvious to gain, he said that the material photographed in Ramey's office was not the material he had collected at the ranch. He was careful about this. He did not say it loudly or dramatically, at least not in his earlier interviews. He said it the way a person says something they have thought about for a long time and decided they may as well finally say clearly. He described the debris he had found at the ranch as unlike anything he had encountered in his career. He mentioned the foil-like material that, when crumpled, would return to its original shape without a crease. He described small beams or sticks with symbols or characters along their length. Not printed tape, he said, but something more like embossed or engraved markings. He said the material was extraordinarily light and could not be bent, burned, or damaged in the ways you would expect from balsa wood or foil. Now, Marcel was speaking from memory about events that had happened years and eventually decades earlier. Memory is not a recording. It changes over time, especially when the events in question have become culturally significant and the person remembering them has been asked to tell the story many times. There is a well-documented phenomenon in which repeated recall of an event, especially in the presence of an interested audience, gradually reshapes the memory to emphasize certain details and smooth over others. It is not dishonesty. It is just how memory works. Marcel may have genuinely believed every word he said in those later interviews, and still have been describing something that had drifted over the years from what actually happened. And yet, he was an experienced military intelligence officer. He'd handled a great deal of unusual equipment during the war. He was not someone who would be easily confused by a weather balloon, roll-in target or otherwise. He said specifically that he had encountered roll-in targets before, and that what he found on the Foster Ranch was not one. That specific denial, not just, it was strange, but I know what roll-in targets look like and this was not that, is harder to set aside than a general claim of strangeness. His son, Jesse Marcel Jr., added another layer to this. Jesse Jr. was around 11 years old in July 1947 when his father stopped at their home in the early morning hours with some of the debris before going onto the base. He described holding pieces of the material as a child. He said he remembered it clearly. The foil that would not stay crumpled, the small beams with what he described as hieroglyphic-like symbols. Jesse Marcel Jr. went on to become a physician, served as a flight surgeon in the Montana National Guard, and flew combat missions in Iraq. He was not by any measure an unstable or credulous person. He gave consistent accounts of that night for the rest of his life, and he always said the same thing. What his father brought home that morning was not a weather balloon. Neither of these accounts is proof of anything extraterrestrial. They are testimony, and testimony has limits, but they are also not nothing. They are first-hand descriptions from people with professional credibility, describing a specific physical experience, and those descriptions do not match what was photographed in Ramey's office on the afternoon of July 8th. The question of whether the debris in those photographs was the same debris Marcel collected at the ranch is one that has never been definitively answered. The photographs exist. The debris in them exists. What happened to the material Marcel originally brought from the ranch is not clearly documented. There is one more detail from those Fort Worth photographs that some researchers have found significant, though it is difficult to assess fairly. In one of the images, General Ramey is holding what appears to be a piece of paper. In the 1990s, an attempt was made to enlarge and enhance the image to read the text on that paper. Various researchers claim to make out fragments of words, including, some said, references to the victims and to the disc. The image quality is far too low to draw reliable conclusions from this, and the readings have been disputed by other analysts. It is mentioned here not as evidence of anything, but as an example of how thoroughly every fragment of the Roswell record has been examined over the decades, and how rarely those examinations produce anything certain. What the official 1947 explanation did accomplish, regardless of its accuracy, was to close the public story quickly and cleanly. The military had an answer. The answer was specific. It had a name, Rowan Target, and a face, Irving Newton, and photographs. It was delivered with the calm authority of a general who was not particularly concerned about the whole affair, and for the vast majority of people who heard it, it was entirely sufficient. The explanation also did something else, something that mattered for the long-term history of this story. It established the pattern that would define every official response to Roswell for the next 50 years. An initial account followed by a correction, followed by photographs, followed by a named expert, followed by closure. The machinery of official explanation was put in place in Fort Worth on July 8th, 1947, and it worked, for a while. But the Rowan Target explanation had a ceiling. It could account for the debris. It could account for the material Brazel found scattered across the Foster Ranch. What it could not account for, and what the military did not address in 1947, because those accounts had not yet entered the public record in any significant way, were the claims that would emerge later about recovered bodies, about a second crash site, about sealed caskets and nurses and hangar doors. Those claims were not part of the 1947 story. They came later, slowly, from different directions, and they changed the nature of the Roswell question entirely. In 1947, the question was what fell on the ranch. The weather balloon explanation answered that question, more or less, and the country accepted it. The question that would eventually make Roswell famous was a different one, and it would take decades to fully surface. For now, though, the official record was settled. A Rowan Target had come down on a ranch in New Mexico. An intelligence officer had mistaken it for something more exotic. A general had corrected the mistake. The press had moved on. The summer of 1947 continued. The Cold War deepened. The Air Force became its own branch in September. The CYA was established. The world kept turning in its anxious and watchful way. Roswell was a footnote. A small, slightly awkward footnote in the history of one military base in the desert. It would stay that way for 30 years. The story did not disappear exactly. It sat quietly in the memories of the people who had been part of it, in the files of the Army Air Forces, in the recollections of a rancher who had been told one way or another not to make too much of it. But it did not grow. It did not spread. It was not, in 1947 or for many years afterward, the cultural phenomenon it would eventually become. What changed everything was not a new discovery or a declassified document. It was a conversation, a single interview between a retired military officer and a researcher who was curious enough to track him down. That conversation happened in 1978, and it brought Jesse Marcel back into the story, and with him came everything that had been waiting quietly in the background for 3 decades. But before we get there, it is worth spending time with the most technically serious alternative to the weather balloon story, the one the Air Force itself would eventually put forward in 1994, nearly 50 years after the fact. Because Project Mogul is not a simple story, and it deserves more than a passing mention. It is in many ways the most honest attempt the government ever made to explain what actually happened in the New Mexico desert in the summer of 1947, and understanding it changes the shape of the whole question in ways that are genuinely worth thinking through carefully. Project Mogul began in 1946, and it was, by any reasonable measure, one of the more quietly ingenious ideas the early Cold War produced. The problem it was trying to solve was both simple and enormous. How do you know when the Soviet Union tests a nuclear bomb? The Soviets were not going to announce it. They were not going to invite observers. The distances involved were vast. The technology for satellite surveillance did not yet exist, and the political relationship between Washington and Moscow was already cold enough that any kind of cooperative monitoring was out of the question. So American scientists and military planners were left to think creatively about how to listen from very far away. The solution came from atmospheric physics. At certain altitudes, roughly between 60,000 and 100,000 feet, there exists what physicists call a sound channel, sometimes referred to as the acoustic duct. It works a bit like a waveguide, trapping low-frequency sound waves and allowing them to travel enormous horizontal distances without dispersing the way they would at lower altitudes. A nuclear explosion produces distinctive low-frequency acoustic signature. If you could place sensitive microphones at that altitude, you could potentially detect a Soviet nuclear test from thousands of miles away. That was the idea behind Project Mogul. The practical challenge was getting instruments up to that altitude and keeping them there long enough to be useful. The solution was balloon trains. Not a single large balloon, but a long chain of them, strung together with nylon cord, carrying a payload of sensors and radar reflectors. The radar reflectors were there so that ground crews could track the balloons using radar, which was the same basic technology used in the raw-wind target devices that General Ramey had displayed in Fort Worth. The reflectors were made of aluminum foil laminated to balsa wood, lightweight, highly reflective, and capable of holding their shape at altitude. The balloon trains used in Project Mogul were not small. A full array could stretch up to 600 feet in length, carrying as many as 24 individual neoprene balloons along with the instrument payload. They were launched from Alamogordo Army Airfield in New Mexico, which is about 90 miles southwest of Roswell, and they were designed to drift at altitude on the prevailing winds. The program was classified at a level above the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell, meaning that personnel at RAAF would not necessarily have had any knowledge of Mogul or its equipment, even though they were operating out of the same general region of New Mexico. Physicist Charles Moore was a young scientist working on Project Mogul in the summer of 1947. He was part of the New York University team contracted to develop and fly the balloon arrays, and he was present for several of the early test flights from Alamogordo. When the Air Force released its 1994 report on Roswell, Moore became one of its most important supporting voices, because he had actually been there, not at the crash site, but in the program, handling the equipment, understanding what it looked like and how it behaved. His testimony was not second-hand. He knew what a Mogul balloon train looked like on the ground and in pieces. The specific flight that the 1994 Air Force report identified as the likely source of the Foster Ranch debris was designated Flight Number 4, launched on June 4, 1947. The records for that particular flight are incomplete. The balloon was tracked for a time and then contact was lost, which was not unusual for these early experimental flights. Moore and his colleagues reconstructed the probable flight path based on upper-level wind data from the period, and that path, when projected forward, placed the balloon's likely landing zone in the general vicinity of the Foster Ranch, about 75 miles north of Roswell. It was not a perfect match, and Moore acknowledged that, but it was consistent enough to be taken seriously. What makes the Mogul explanation genuinely compelling is not just the geography, it is the physical description of the debris itself. The accounts from Mac Brazel, from Jesse Marcel, from Loretta Proctor, all describe material that sounds, when you think about it carefully, like what you would find if a 600-foot balloon train had come apart and scattered across open rangeland. Foil-like material, consistent with the radar reflector panels, thin, lightweight beams or sticks, consistent with the balsa wood structural elements of the reflector arrays, tape with patterned markings. Moore himself noted that the tape used on the Mogul reflectors was a commercial product decorated with a repeating geometric pattern, sometimes described as flower-like or hieroglyphic by people who had not seen it before. Brazel described material that he said was not ordinary, that it was tough, that it did not tear easily, that it did not burn when he tried to burn it. Neoprene rubber from the balloons, particularly after weeks of exposure to the New Mexico sun, could become brittle and darkened, not obviously recognizable as the kind of rubber you would find in an everyday context. And then there is the question of why the military responded the way it did. If what fell on the Foster Ranch was a classified Project Mogul balloon train, the secrecy makes immediate sense. You could not publicly announce that you were flying classified acoustic monitoring equipment over New Mexico, because doing so would reveal to the Soviets both the nature of the program and the technology involved. The cover story of a weather balloon was not far from the truth. Mogul did use weather balloons as part of its arrays, and it was simple enough to be believable and specific enough to close the story. The personnel at RAAF who recovered the debris may genuinely not have known what they were looking at, because the classification level of Mogul was above their access. Major Marcel, despite his role as an intelligence officer, would not necessarily have been briefed on a program that was being run out of a different command structure entirely. This is one of the things that the Mogul explanation handles better than most people give it credit for. It does not require anyone to be lying outright. Marcel could have genuinely believed the material was anomalous, because to him it was. He had no frame of reference for Mogul equipment. General Ramey could have known exactly what it was and chosen the simplest available cover story without fabricating anything dramatic. The press release calling it a flying disc might have been an honest mistake by Lieutenant Hout, who was working from a description passed through several people before it reached him, and who issued it before anyone with full knowledge of the situation had reviewed it. The rapid correction could have been a genuine effort to contain an accidental disclosure, not a cover-up of something extraterrestrial. That is the strongest version of the Mogul argument, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is actually quite coherent. It does not require a vast conspiracy. It does not require the systematic silencing of dozens of witnesses. It requires a classified program, a chain of communication failures, a press officer who moved too quickly, and a general who had to clean up the mess without revealing what the mess actually was. But the Mogul explanation also has limits, and it is worth being honest about those too. The first is the time gap between the launch of Flight Number 4 on June 4th and Brazel's discovery around July 5th or 6th. That is roughly a month. The debris field Brazel described was large. He estimated it covered an area of about 3/4 of a mile in length and a few hundred yards wide. If a 600-foot balloon train had come down in early June, it had been sitting in the New Mexico sun for a month by the time Brazel found it. Some researchers have questioned whether the material would have remained as distinctive and puzzling as Brazel described after that much exposure to the elements. Others have pointed out that Brazel rode through that part of the ranch regularly, and had not noticed the debris before, which raises the question of exactly when it came down. These are not decisive objections, but they are genuine ones. The second limit is that the mogul explanation was not put forward until 1994, 47 years after the event. The Air Force's own 1994 report acknowledges that the Project Mogul records are incomplete, that Flight Number 4 specifically lacks full documentation, and that the identification of that particular flight as the source of the Foster Ranch debris is based on reconstruction rather than direct evidence. Charles Moore's wind analysis was careful and professional, but it was also conducted nearly 50 years after the fact, using historical weather data that may itself be incomplete. This does not mean the conclusion is wrong. It means the conclusion is probabilistic, not certain, and it is worth being clear about the difference. The third limit, and this is the one that has always defined the boundary of what Mogul can and cannot explain, is that the Mogul hypothesis addresses the debris on the Foster Ranch. It does not address the claims about recovered bodies, about non-human remains, about child-size caskets and sealed hangars. Those claims were not part of the original 1947 story, and Mogul has nothing to say about them. The Air Force addressed the body claims separately in its 1997 follow-up report through a different mechanism entirely. But in terms of the debris itself, the foil, the sticks, the tape, the strange material that Marcel brought back to Roswell, Mogul remains the most technically grounded explanation available. It is also worth noting what it meant for the Mogul explanation to come out in 1994 rather than in 1947. By 1994, the Roswell story had already been a cultural phenomenon for more than a decade. Books had been written, documentaries had aired, witnesses had given interviews, and the narrative of a government cover-up had taken on a life of its own. The Air Force's 1994 report was received not as a clarification, but as a new development in an ongoing controversy, and many people who had already committed to a more dramatic version of events were not inclined to accept it. That is not entirely unreasonable. The timing did raise the question of why, if this was always the answer, it had taken the government nearly 50 years to say so. The Air Force's response to that question was essentially that Project Mogul had remained classified long enough that previous inquiries had not been able to access the relevant records, and that it was only the combination of declassification and the specific congressional pressure of 1994 that made a full accounting possible. That explanation is plausible. Whether it is entirely satisfying depends perhaps on how much trust you extend to institutions in general and to this particular institution in this particular era. What is genuinely fair to say is this. If you're trying to explain what Mac Brazel found on the Foster Ranch in the summer of 1947, Project Mogul is a serious, technically grounded, internally consistent explanation that accounts for most of the physical evidence and most of the behavioural evidence, the secrecy, the rapid correction, the cover story, without requiring anything extraordinary. It is the kind of explanation that, had it been offered in 1947 with full documentation, would probably have closed the story entirely. But it was not offered in 1947. The story was closed instead with a weather balloon and a radar reflector and a general who seemed mildly annoyed by the whole business. And in that gap between what the military said in 1947 and what the Air Force said in 1994, the Roswell story found the space it needed to grow into something much larger than a debris field on a ranch in New Mexico. The debris, in the end, may well have an explanation. The explanation may be Project Mogul, but the debris was only ever part of the story. The other part, the part that would eventually come to define Roswell in the public imagination, the part that no classified balloon program can account for, was already beginning to surface, in fragments, in the memories and the careful silences of the people who had been closest to what happened. And it was not about foil and balsa wood. It was about something far harder to explain and far harder to dismiss. So let us talk about the bodies. Because the debris, as strange as it was, as contested as the material evidence has remained across more than 7 decades, was never really the heart of the Roswell story. The debris is what started the conversation, but the bodies are what kept it alive, and the body claims are, without question, the most complicated, the most emotionally charged, and the least verifiable part of everything that surrounds the events of July 1947. It is worth saying up front, before going any further, that the accounts of recovered non-human remains were not part of the original public story. When Lieutenant Walter Haut issued his press release on July 8, 1947, it mentioned a flying disc. It did not mention bodies. When General Roger Ramey held his press conference in Fort Worth and identified the debris as a weather balloon, he did not mention bodies either. The newspapers that ran and then retracted the flying disc story did not include any reports of recovered remains. The body accounts came later, some of them years later, some of them decades later, and they came through a different set of channels, from a different set of people, with a different set of problems attached to them. That does not necessarily mean the accounts are false, but it does mean they require a different kind of scrutiny, and it means that anyone approaching Roswell honestly has to hold the debris story and the body story somewhat separately, even though popular culture has long since fused them into a single narrative. The first and most widely discussed of the body accounts comes from a man named Glenn Dennis. Dennis was a young mortician in 1947 working at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. The funeral home had a contract with Roswell Army Airfield to provide mortuary services, which was not unusual. Military bases routinely contracted with local businesses for a range of services. Dennis later recalled that in early July 1947, he received a series of phone calls from a mortuary officer at RAAF, asking some very specific and unusual questions. The officer wanted to know about child-sized, hermetically sealed caskets, specifically whether the funeral home had any in stock and how quickly they could be obtained. He also asked Dennis about the preservation of bodies that had been exposed to the elements for a period of time, and whether exposure to certain conditions would compromise the integrity of remains. Dennis said the call struck him as odd, but that he did not think much of them initially. He also claimed that sometime around that same period he drove out to the base on unrelated business and encountered a level of unusual activity. Military police, personnel he did not recognize, a general atmosphere of controlled urgency. He said he was told in no uncertain terms by an officer he did not know that he should leave and that he had not seen anything. He claimed that a nurse he knew at the base, a woman he referred to for years as Naomi Self, later told him in confidence that she had assisted at what she described as autopsies on non-human bodies, small, with large heads, long fingers, and unusual internal anatomy. Dennis said she sketched some of what she'd seen on a piece of paper during their conversation. The problem with Glenn Dennis's account is significant, and it needs to be stated clearly. Researchers who attempted to verify the nurse's identity spent years trying to locate any record of a nurse named Naomi Self, or any name close to it, stationed at RAAF in 1947. They found nothing. The RAAF records from that period are incomplete, which complicates the search, but the absence of any corroborating documentation for this specific individual has been a persistent and serious issue. Dennis himself, over the years, gave slightly different versions of certain details, and in 1995 he admitted that the name he had given for the nurse was not her real name. He said he had used a pseudonym to protect her identity. He later offered a different name, but that name also could not be verified. Critics argued that the changing details undermined the account's credibility considerably. Supporters argued that Dennis was protecting a source, which is not inherently suspicious. What is fair to say is that without a verifiable identity for the nurse, the most dramatic element of Dennis's testimony, the description of the bodies, rests entirely on his word alone. Then there is the account of Grady Barnett, known as Barney. Barnett was a soil conservation engineer who worked for the federal government in New Mexico. Friends and family members later reported that Barnett had told them, in private conversations during his lifetime, that he had come across a crashed disc-shaped object on the plains of San Agustin, a high desert plain west of Socorro, New Mexico, significantly further from Roswell than the Foster Ranch. He reportedly said the object was metallic and circular, and that there were bodies nearby, small humanoid figures in tight-fitting suits. He claimed that military personnel arrived shortly after and ordered him and others who had gathered at the scene to leave. Barnett himself died in 1969 before the serious Roswell investigation began, so he was never interviewed directly by any researcher. Everything attributed to him comes second-hand, through people who remembered what he'd said in casual conversation, sometimes years before they were asked to recall it in detail. The Plains of San Agustin account introduced a geographic complication that researchers have never fully resolved. If the crash site was on the Plains of San Agustin, it was more than 150 miles from the Foster Ranch debris field. This led to theories about two separate crash sites, one where the main craft came down, one where debris was scattered. But those theories required a level of additional speculation that moved the discussion further from documented evidence. Some researchers accepted the Barnett account as a separate but related incident. Others considered it a separate story that had become entangled with Roswell through the process of investigation and retelling. And then there is Frank Kaufman. Kaufman was one of the more prominent witnesses to emerge from the intensive civilian investigations of the late 1980s and 1990s. He claimed to have been a military intelligence agent at RF in 1947, and he gave detailed, specific accounts of a crash site, a recovered craft, and recovered bodies. His descriptions were vivid and internally consistent, and for a time he was considered a significant witness by several researchers. After his death in 2001, however, investigators who examined his personal papers found documents that appeared to have been fabricated, military records, orders, and other materials that did not match official records, and showed signs of having been created long after the fact. The consensus among serious Roswell researchers, including some who had initially found Kaufman credible, shifted considerably after those discoveries. Kevin Randall, one of the most thorough civilian investigators of the Roswell case, later wrote that Kaufman's testimony could not be relied upon, and that the fabricated documents significantly damaged his credibility across the board. This is worth noting not to dismiss the broader case, but because intellectual honesty about Roswell requires acknowledging that some of the most dramatic testimony in the entire body of witness accounts turned out to be, at best, unreliable, and at worst, deliberately constructed. The Kaufman situation illustrates one of the genuine difficulties in studying Roswell at all. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the story had become famous enough that coming forward as a Roswell witness carried social currency. There were books being written, documentaries being made, researchers actively seeking people with connections to the 1947 events. In that environment, it is not surprising that some accounts that emerged were exaggerated, embellished, or in some cases invented. That does not mean all accounts were. It means the process of sorting genuine recollection from cultural contamination, from wishful thinking, from outright fabrication, became increasingly difficult the longer the story ran. By the time the major civilian investigations were in full swing, the events in question were already 40 years old. What makes the body account so difficult to assess is not just the lack of documentation, it is the nature of the claims themselves. If non-human bodies were recovered from a crash site in New Mexico in 1947, the implications are so large, so civilization-altering, that the absence of any verifiable physical evidence becomes almost incomprehensible. Either the suppression of that evidence represents the most successful and sustained information operation in human history, maintained across multiple administrations, thousands of personnel, and more than 70 years, or the bodies, as described, did not exist in the form that witnesses claimed. Both of those possibilities are genuinely difficult to sit with, for different reasons. The Air Force, in its 1997 follow-up report, addressed the body accounts through a mechanism that itself became controversial. The report suggested that memories of small humanoid figures with unusual features could be explained by the crash test dummies used in Project High Dive, a program that dropped human-shaped dummies from high-altitude balloons to test parachute systems and assess survival equipment. The dummies were roughly human in shape, dressed in flight suits, and were sometimes recovered in remote desert terrain by military teams. The Air Force proposed that these recoveries, which began in 1954, could have been misremembered or misidentified as the source of the body accounts. The obvious problem, which critics raised immediately, and which the Air Force's own report acknowledged, is the time gap. Project High Dive began in 1954. The Roswell incident was in 1947. 7 years separated the two. The Air Force's explanation essentially asked people to accept that witnesses had misremembered the year of events by nearly a decade, that memories of dummy recoveries in the mid-1950s had somehow been folded back into recollections of July 1947. The report attempted to address this by suggesting that memory is not reliably anchored to specific dates, and that witnesses recalling events from 30 or 40 years earlier might conflate separate incidents. That is not an unreasonable observation about human memory in general, but as an explanation for specific detailed accounts tied to a specific documented moment in time, it struck many people, including some who were not particularly invested in the extraterrestrial interpretation, as a stretch. What the body accounts leave you with ultimately is a set of stories that are individually problematic and collectively impossible to verify, but that also cannot be entirely dismissed without a degree of certainty that the evidence does not support. Glenn Dennis may have been mistaken, or embellishing, or telling the truth about conversations that themselves were mistaken. Barney Barnett may have seen something unusual and described it imperfectly to friends who then remembered it imperfectly years later. The nurse who sketched figures on a napkin may or may not have existed. These are not satisfying conclusions, but unsatisfying is not the same as wrong. What is clear is that the body accounts change the nature of the Roswell story permanently. Without them, Roswell is a story about a classified balloon program, a hasty cover story, a confused rancher, and a military intelligence officer who spent the rest of his life insisting he had handled something extraordinary. That is an interesting story. It raises genuine questions about government transparency and institutional behaviour, but it is a bounded story, one that can be examined and assessed against known facts and documented programs. With the body accounts, Roswell becomes something else entirely. It becomes a story about contact, about concealment at the deepest possible level, about a secret so large that its maintenance would require the cooperation of every president, every intelligence director, every military chief of staff since 1947. It becomes the story that underlies almost every serious UFO conspiracy theory that followed, the gravitational centre around which decades of speculation have orbited, and it is worth pausing on that just for a moment because it matters to how we understand what came next. The body accounts did not emerge fully formed in 1947. They accumulated slowly, over years and decades, as the investigation grew and as the cultural appetite for the story expanded. Each new account added texture and detail to a narrative that was already forming. Each new witness who came forward with a piece of the story, some credible, some not, some impossible to assess, added another layer to something that had begun as a debris field on a sheep ranch and grown into one of the most contested events in modern American history. The debris might have an explanation. Project Mogul is a serious and technically grounded one, but the body accounts exist in a different space, a space where documentation is sparse, verification is nearly impossible, and the passage of time has done more to complicate the picture than to clarify it. They are the part of the Roswell story that official explanations have never quite managed to close, and they are the part that, for many people, remains the most important question of all. But here is something worth remembering as we move forward. The body accounts, for all their complexity and contested detail, were not what brought Roswell back into the national conversation after 30 years of relative quiet. That happened because of one man, a retired military intelligence officer who had been at the ranch, who had loaded the debris into his car, who had stopped at his house on the way back to the base to show his wife and his young son what he had found. He had stayed silent for more than 3 decades, and then, in 1978, he agreed to talk. His name was Jesse Marcel, and by 1978 he was living quietly in Houma, Louisiana, retired from the Air Force, working as a television repairman. He had served his country for years, earned his rank, done his job. He had not spoken publicly about what he found on the Foster Ranch in the summer of 1947, not in a meaningful way, not in the way that would have mattered. For 31 years, the official explanation had stood: weather balloon, radar reflector, case closed, and Jesse Marcel had let it stand. Stanton Friedman was not a journalist exactly, though he had the instincts of one. He was a nuclear physicist who had worked on classified programs for companies including General Electric and McDonnell Douglas, and who had become, by the late 1970s, one of the most methodical civilian researchers working on the UFO question. He was not the wide-eyed, credulous type. He was trained to assess evidence, to ask precise questions, to notice when explanations did not quite fit the facts they were supposed to explain. When Friedman tracked down Jesse Marcel in 1978 and sat across from him with a tape recorder, he was not looking for confirmation of a theory he already held. He was looking for what the man actually remembered. What Marcel told him was quiet and specific and, in its own way, devastating to the official record. He said the material he had collected at the Foster Ranch was not a weather balloon. He was clear about that. He had seen weather balloons. He had handled them, examined them, worked around them. He knew what they looked like and what they felt like and what they were made of. The material he loaded into his car that July morning in 1947 was not that. It was something he had no category for. He described foil-like material that was incredibly thin and light, but that could not be permanently creased or bent, that would return to its original shape no matter what you did to it. He described small beams or sticks with symbols on them, not quite like any writing he recognized, not quite like anything he could name. He described the sheer quantity of it, scattered across a wide area of desert scrub, as though whatever it had been had come apart at speed and spread itself across the landscape. Marcel was not excitable in the interview. He was not trying to sell a story. He was a man in his early 60s recounting something he'd seen more than 30 years before, and the weight of it came through not in dramatic language, but in the plain, steady way he talked about it. He said he'd been embarrassed, or at least troubled by the weather balloon explanation, not because he wanted to make headlines, but because he knew it was wrong, and he had spent 3 decades knowing it was wrong and saying nothing. He also talked about the night he stopped at his house on the way back to the base. It was late, and his wife and his son, Jesse Jr., were asleep. He woke them up. He spread some of the debris out on the kitchen floor and showed it to them. He wanted them to see it. He said later that he felt, even then, that he was looking at something that mattered, something that deserved a witness beyond just himself. Jesse Jr. was 11 years old that night. He knelt on the kitchen floor and held pieces of the material in his hands. He looked at the symbols on the small beams. He tried to dent the foil. It came back flat. Jesse Marcel Jr. grew up to be a physician. He served as a flight surgeon in the Montana Army National Guard and was deployed to Iraq in 2004 at the age of 68. He was not a fringe figure, not someone whose life was defined by that one night on the kitchen floor. But he talked about it, consistently, across decades. He gave interviews. He wrote a book with his daughter, published in 2009, called The Roswell Legacy. And in every account across all those years, the details stayed essentially the same. The foil, the beams, the symbols, the way the material felt in his hands. He described it as one of the clearest memories of his childhood, not because it was frightening, but because it was so unlike anything else he ever encountered before or after. The consistency of Jesse Jr.'s account matters for a specific reason. Memory research tells us that recollections of emotionally significant events from childhood can be remarkably stable in their core features, even when peripheral details shift over time. An 11-year-old who handles strange material in the middle of the night, brought home by his father who is clearly treating it as something important. That is the kind of memory that tends to stick. It does not prove what the material was. but it does suggest that something unusual was in that kitchen and that a child who later became a careful, scientifically trained adult never stopped believing that what he held was real. Jesse Marcel Sr. died in June 1986. He had lived long enough to see the Roswell story begin its long return to public attention, but not long enough to see how large it would eventually grow. He gave several interviews in his later years, to Friedman and to others, and his account remained consistent in its essentials. He never claimed to have seen a craft. He never described bodies. He spoke specifically and carefully about the debris, about the material itself, about the experience of handling something he could not explain. He was not a man who seemed to be embellishing. He was a man who seemed, if anything, to have been quietly frustrated for 30 years by the distance between what he knew and what had been said publicly. The 1980 book that brought all of this to a mass audience was called The Roswell Incident, written by Charles Berlitz and William Moore. Berlitz was already famous, or perhaps notorious, as the author of the Bermuda Triangle, which had sold millions of copies and which had been substantially debunked in the years since its publication. That association was not helpful to the credibility of the new book. But Moore was a more careful researcher, and the book itself drew on Friedman's interview with Marcel as its central piece of evidence. It was the first time most Americans encountered the Roswell story in anything like its full form. Not the brief 1947 newspaper reports, not the quick official retraction, but a sustained account of what witnesses claimed had actually happened. The book sold well. It introduced the term Roswell Incident into the popular vocabulary. It raised the Marcel testimony to prominence, and it opened a door that, once opened, proved impossible to close. What followed through the 1980s was a slow but accelerating expansion of the investigation. Researchers began tracking down people who had been in Roswell in 1947. Former base personnel, local civilians, ranchers and neighbours and radio reporters and morticians. Many of them were elderly by then. Some had never spoken publicly about what they claimed to have seen or heard. Some had stories that were impossible to verify, and some had stories that fit, more or less, into a coherent picture of unusual military activity in the days following the initial discovery. The Marcel testimony sat at the centre of all of it, because Marcel was not an anonymous source or a second-hand account. He was the intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group. He was the man the base commander sent to the ranch. He was the man who collected the material, handled it, transported it. If anyone on the military side of the 1947 response could speak with authority about what had been found, it was him. And he said, clearly and repeatedly, that the weather balloon explanation was false. The Air Force's position, then and later, was that Marcel had been mistaken, that what he handled at the ranch was indeed mogul balloon debris, and that his memory of something extraordinary was shaped by decades of reflection, and perhaps by the cultural weight of the story he had become part of. That is a possible explanation. Human memory does not preserve experience like a recording. It reconstructs, and reconstruction is vulnerable to influence. A man who spent 30 years thinking about something unusual he had seen could, over time, elaborate on that memory in ways he was not consciously aware of. But there is a tension in that explanation that is hard to resolve cleanly. Marcel was an experienced military intelligence officer. Part of his job was accurate observation and accurate reporting. He had handled all manner of military equipment. He explicitly said he knew what a weather balloon looked like. The mogul balloon trains used standard Rowan radar reflectors, foil and balsa wood devices that were not classified, that were used widely, that Marcel almost certainly would have encountered in some form during his military career. The Air Force's explanation requires accepting that a trained intelligence officer failed to recognize relatively standard equipment, and then, over 30 years, convinced himself that what he had actually seen was something far stranger. That is possible. It is genuinely possible. But it is not the only possible reading of the evidence, and the Marcel testimony, taken on its own terms, is not easy to simply set aside. What makes the whole thing more complicated still is the photograph. In the photographs taken at General Ramey's office in Fort Worth on July 8, 1947, the photographs that accompanied the weather balloon explanation, Marcel is shown kneeling beside what appears to be crumpled foil and rubber material. These photographs were presented as showing the actual debris recovered from the Foster Ranch. Marcel later said they were not. He said the material in the photographs was not what he had collected. Whether the substitution was deliberate, or whether Marcel was simply mistaken about what he was looking at in a chaotic, fast-moving day, is something the photographs themselves cannot resolve. But the claim introduced a specific and troubling possibility that the photographic record of the Roswell incident was staged, at least in part. In the 1990s, researchers applied digital enhancement techniques to one of the Ramey photographs and claimed to have partially read a document that Ramey appears to be holding in his hand, a document that some analysts suggested contained language about victims of the wreck and references to a specific site. The analysis was contested, as such things always are, and the resolution of the original photograph is not high enough to produce a definitive reading. But the effort itself illustrated something important about how the Roswell investigation had evolved. It had become, by the 1990s, a serious technical and archival enterprise, not just a collection of colourful stories. Jesse Marcel Jr., in his later interviews, was always careful to say what he knew and what he did not know. He knew what he had held in his hands. He did not know where it came from. He did not know what it was. He was an 11-year-old boy on a kitchen floor in the middle of the night, and his father was showing him something strange, and he had never forgotten it. He thought the Project Mogul explanation was inadequate. He said so plainly. But he did not claim certainty about what the alternative was. That kind of carefulness is worth noting, because it is rarer in the Roswell story than you might expect. The story attracted over time a great many people who were entirely certain about things that the evidence did not support. Certain that it was extraterrestrial, certain that it was a balloon, certain that there was a cover-up, certain that there was nothing to cover up. The Marcel family, father and son, occupied a quieter position. They knew something unusual had happened. They did not know exactly what, and they were not willing to pretend otherwise in either direction. Jesse. Marcel Sr.'s decision to speak to Stanton Friedman in 1978 was, in a very real sense, the moment Roswell became the Roswell we know. Without that interview, the story might have remained a footnote, a brief, strange episode from the summer of 1947 that the official record had tidied up and moved on from. The press release, the retraction, the weather balloon, the end. With that interview, and with everything that followed from it, Roswell became something else. An open question, a permanent challenge to the official account, a case that would draw researchers and investigators and writers and filmmakers for decades. The book that Berlitz and Moore published in 1980 was only the beginning. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the investigation expanded steadily. More witnesses, more interviews, more documents requested through the Freedom of Information Act. More researchers arriving in Roswell to talk to aging residents who had been there in 1947. The story was growing, and as it grew, it became harder to manage, harder to assess, harder to separate the documented from the embellished and the genuine from the contaminated. The civilian investigation that followed was enormous in scale and uneven in quality, and it produced a body of testimony that is both the strongest argument for taking Roswell seriously and the most persistent obstacle to understanding it clearly. Because when you have 200 witnesses, interviewed over 40 years, by researchers with varying levels of rigour and varying degrees of investment in particular conclusions, what you have is not a clean evidentiary record. What you have is something more complicated and more human than that, and that is where the story was heading next. So in 1994, something shifted. Not in the desert, not in a hangar, not in the memories of aging witnesses. It shifted in Washington. Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, responding to years of constituent interest and his own frustration with the official record, requested that the General Accounting Office, the investigative arm of Congress, look into what had actually happened in Roswell in 1947. Schiff was not a UFO enthusiast by any obvious measure. He was a former prosecutor, a careful man with a fairly practical reputation. What bothered him, he said, was not necessarily the question of what fell on the Foster Ranch. What bothered him was the feeling that the government had not been straight with the public about it. He wanted documents. He wanted a paper trail. He wanted someone to go through the official record and explain in plain terms what was there and what was not. The GAO investigation took about a year, and what it found, or more precisely what it failed to find, turned out to be one of the more quietly significant details in the entire Roswell story. The outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield for the period covering July and August of 1947, the exact window of the incident, were missing. Not classified, not restricted, not held in a separate archive pending declassification review. Missing. Destroyed at some point, though the GAO could not determine exactly when, or by whom or under what authority. The standard retention requirements for that kind of record had apparently not been followed, or had been overridden, or had simply not been applied. The GAO noted this plainly in its report. It did not speculate about what the missing records might have contained. It simply recorded that they were gone. Now, records get lost. Records get destroyed. Bureaucratic systems fail. Filing procedures get ignored. Wartime and post-war administrative chaos produces gaps in archives that have nothing sinister behind them. That is genuinely true and worth keeping in mind. The missing Roswell messages are not on their own proof of anything, but they are a specific, documented absence, and in a case where so much turns on what the official record does and does not show, a documented absence in exactly the right time and place is at least worth noting carefully. Alongside the GAO investigation, the Air Force conducted its own internal review, which it published in 1994 under the title The Roswell Report: Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. This was a substantial document, over 1,000 pages of appendices and supporting material. Its central conclusion was that the debris recovered from the Foster Ranch in 1947 was most likely from Project Mogul, the classified balloon program designed to monitor Soviet nuclear activity. The report laid out the Mogul explanation in considerable detail: the balloon trains, the radar reflectors, the flight paths, the classification level that would have motivated secrecy. It was a serious document prepared by Colonel Richard Weaver, and it engaged with the evidence more carefully than the 1947 weather balloon press conference had. Most serious researchers, even those who remained sceptical of the government's overall handling of the case, acknowledged that the Mogul explanation was the most credible official account that had ever been offered for the debris. The timeline was plausible. The physical description of Mogul equipment matched some of what witnesses had described. The secrecy was explicable. Charles Moore, the physicist who had worked directly on Project Mogul in 1947, supported the conclusion and provided technical detail about the balloon trains that added weight to the argument. He was not a government spokesperson. He was a scientist who had been there, and he thought Mogul explained what Brazel had found. But the 1994 report had a boundary. It addressed the debris. It did not fully address the bodies. That was left to the follow-up, published in 1997, the Roswell Report, Case Closed. And this is where things got genuinely complicated, not because the Air Force was being evasive exactly, but because the explanation it offered introduced a new set of problems while trying to resolve the old ones. The 1997 report's answer to the body accounts was Project High Dive. High Dive was a real program, an Air Force project that used anthropomorphic dummies, human-shaped test figures, dropped from high-altitude balloons to test parachute systems and study the effects of high-altitude ejection on the human body. Between 1954 and 1959, the Air Force conducted 67 such drops over the New Mexico desert. The dummies were roughly human-sized, dressed in flight suits, and when recovered after a drop, they were sometimes transported by military vehicles and handled by personnel in ways that, the report suggested, could have been misinterpreted by civilians who witnessed the recoveries. The argument was that some of the body accounts in the Roswell story, Glenn Dennis's claims about small caskets and preserved bodies, the various descriptions of non-human figures being moved by military personnel, were actually distorted memories of these dummy drops, filtered through decades of time and shaped by the cultural expectations that had built up around Roswell by the time witnesses were being interviewed. It was a reasonable hypothesis, in a narrow sense. People do misremember. Memories do get contaminated by later information. A civilian who saw a military recovery team handling a human-shaped dummy in the New Mexico desert in 1956 might, 40 years later, and deep in the middle of the Roswell cultural moment, connect that memory to the 1947 story in ways they were not consciously aware of. The problem, and critics pointed this out immediately and with some force, was the dates. Project High Dive began in 1954. The Roswell incident was in 1947. The gap is 7 years. The report was essentially asking people to accept that witnesses who described events from 1947 were actually remembering things that happened, at the earliest, in 1954. The Air Force acknowledged this gap, but suggested that memory compression and confusion over time could account for it. People sometimes misplace events by years, the report noted, especially when those events were not particularly significant to them at the time and only became significant in retrospect. That is true. It happens. Memory research supports the general principle. But 7 years is a substantial displacement, and applying it to multiple independent witnesses who all placed body-related events in the summer of 1947 specifically required a fairly aggressive reading of how memory compression works. Critics were not being unreasonable when they said the explanation felt strained. There was also the matter of the dummies themselves. The anthropomorphic test figures used in High Dive were approximately 6 feet tall and weighed around 175 pounds. They were designed to approximate an adult human male for parachute testing purposes. Witness descriptions of the Roswell bodies, and here the accounts vary considerably, which is its own problem, often described figures that were smaller than a normal human adult, with proportionally larger heads and unusual physical features. The dummies did not match those descriptions particularly well. The Air Force suggested that the size discrepancy could also be attributed to memory distortion and the psychological effect of seeing something unexpected in an unfamiliar context. That explanation is not impossible, but it layered one uncertain assumption on top of another, and by the time you had stacked them all together, the explanatory structure was carrying a lot of weight. What the 1997 report did accomplish, in a practical sense, was to formally close the Air Force's engagement with the Roswell case. The official position, from that point forward, was that the matter had been fully investigated. The debris was from Project Mogul. The body accounts were attributable to High Dive and other accidents and incidents, and there was nothing further to examine. Case closed, as the title said. The reaction to the report was about what you might expect. Researchers who had spent years investigating Roswell found it inadequate. They documented the timeline problems with High Dive in detail and argued that the report had not seriously engaged with the most specific and well-documented witness accounts. Some members of the public found the report reassuring. A thorough government investigation had looked into this and provided a rational explanation, and that was enough. Others found the High Dive argument so obviously problematic that it deepened their suspicion rather than relieving it. If the Air Force's best explanation required a 7-year memory displacement applied to multiple witnesses, what did that say about the quality of the investigation? And then there were people, probably the largest group if you're being honest about how these things work, who had already made up their minds and processed the report through whatever framework they had already committed to. One specific detail from the 1997 report that did not get as much attention as the dummy explanation was the section dealing with personnel injuries. The report also attributed some body-related accounts to Air Force personnel who had been injured in balloon accidents and aircraft incidents during the late 1940s and early 1950s. People who were sometimes transported under unusual conditions, with medical personnel in attendance, in ways that could have generated rumours or misinterpretations if observed by civilians. This was a quieter argument than the dummy explanation, and in some ways a more plausible one, though it still required accepting that witnesses had significantly misremembered the timing and nature of what they had seen. The broader difficulty with both Air Force reports, and this is something worth sitting with for a moment, is that they were produced by the institution whose conduct was under examination. That is not an accusation of bad faith. Government agencies investigate themselves all the time, and they sometimes do it honestly and carefully. But it does mean that the reports carried an inherent credibility problem that no amount of supporting documentation could fully dissolve. The Air Force was, in effect, being asked to explain why the Air Force had behaved in certain ways in 1947, using records that the Air Force controlled, producing a conclusion that the Air Force found acceptable. The GAO investigation was an attempt to provide some independent oversight, but its scope was limited, and its most notable finding was an absence, those missing outgoing messages, rather than a positive discovery. What the 1994 and 1997 reports did change, in a meaningful way, was the terms of the public debate. Before 1994, the official position was essentially the 1947 weather balloon story, which most serious researchers had long since found untenable. After 1994, the official position was mogul, which was a substantially more credible explanation, and forced researchers to engage with it seriously rather than dismissing it. The mogul explanation did not close the case. There were still questions it did not answer, and the body accounts remained entirely outside its scope, but it raised the evidentiary bar. Arguments against the official explanation now had to contend with a more sophisticated version of that explanation than they had faced before. Some researchers accepted mogul as a sufficient explanation for the debris and shifted their focus to the body accounts, which they felt were the stronger evidence for something genuinely anomalous. Others rejected mogul on the grounds that it still did not account for Marcel's specific testimony about the physical properties of the material he had handled. Still others began to argue that the body accounts and the debris field were actually two separate incidents, that whatever Brazel found on the Foster Ranch might have been one thing, and that the body-related accounts referred to a different location and a different event entirely, possibly the plains of San Agustin site that Barney Barnett had described years earlier. That fragmentation of the story, the possibility that Roswell was not one event, but several overlapping events that had been conflated over time, was one of the more interesting intellectual developments in the civilian investigation of the 1990s. It was also, practically speaking, a difficult position to defend, because it multiplied the number of things that needed explaining rather than reducing them. By the late 1990s, the official government position was settled, and the civilian research community was more active than it had ever been, producing books and documentaries and conference presentations at a pace that would have been unimaginable in 1947. The story had taken on a life entirely its own, fed by the Air Force reports, by the growing body of witness testimony, and by a broader cultural moment in the 1990s that was unusually receptive to questions about government secrecy and institutional honesty. The timing was not coincidental, and it meant the next chapter of the Roswell story, the civilian investigation in full, with all its scale and all its complications, was already well underway even as the Air Force was trying to formally end the conversation. The civilian investigation into Roswell was not a single organised effort. It was more like a long, slow accumulation, researchers working independently or in small groups, interviewing aging witnesses, filing records requests, cross-referencing accounts, and publishing their findings in books and papers and conference proceedings over a period of roughly 2 decades. It had no central authority, no shared methodology, and no agreed standard for what would count as sufficient evidence. What it did have, by the late 1980s and through the 1990s, was scale. The sheer number of people working on Roswell and the sheer number of witnesses they had located and interviewed made it one of the most thoroughly investigated UFO cases in history, at least in terms of raw effort. Whether that effort produced reliable knowledge is a different and more complicated question. The Mutual UFO Network, known as MUFON, was one of the more organised forces in this effort. Founded in 1969, MUFON had by the 1980s developed a national network of field investigators and a more or less standardised approach to collecting witness testimony. Their involvement in Roswell gave the investigation some structural coherence, though it also meant that the investigation was being conducted by an organisation with a stated interest in the subject, which is worth keeping in mind when evaluating their conclusions. That is not a dismissal of their work. It is just an honest acknowledgement that no investigation exists in a vacuum, and the Roswell civilian investigation certainly did not. The book that probably did the most to shape how the civilian investigation developed was UFO Crash at Roswell, published in 1991 by Kevin Randle and Donald Schmitt. Randle was a retired Army officer and longtime UFO researcher. Schmitt had been MUFON's Director of Special Investigations. Together they conducted what they described as interviews with more than 200 witnesses over several years. People who had some claim connection to the events of July 1947, whether directly or through family members who had been involved. The book was detailed, methodical in its presentation, and serious in tone. It made a substantial impact on public awareness of the case, and helped establish the framework through which most people understood Roswell through the 1990s. It also eventually ran into serious problems. Schmitt's credentials turned out to be partly fabricated. He had claimed a graduate degree he did not have, and his credibility took a significant hit when this was revealed in the mid-1990s. Randall later distanced himself from some of their joint conclusions, particularly around specific witnesses whose accounts had not held up well under further scrutiny. This did not invalidate the entire body of research, but it was a reminder that the civilian investigation had its own credibility problems, alongside the ones it was trying to expose in the official record. The witness testimony gathered through the 1980s and 1990s is genuinely difficult to evaluate. On one hand, the volume of it is striking. Hundreds of people, many of them with no obvious motive to fabricate stories, described experiences and observations that were at least consistent with something unusual having happened near Roswell in July 1947. On the other hand, almost all of these accounts were collected 30 to 50 years after the events they described by researchers who were not neutral, in a cultural environment that had become saturated with Roswell imagery and mythology. The conditions for memory contamination were nearly ideal, and any honest assessment of the witness testimony has to take that seriously. Memory is not a recording. It is reconstructive. Every time you recall something, you're partly rebuilding it, and the rebuilding is influenced by what you have experienced and learned since the original event. Over 30 or 40 years, a person who had a genuine but ambiguous experience in 1947, who saw something they did not fully understand, or heard something from a colleague, or noticed something unusual during their work at the base, could easily have developed a memory that was shaped, at least in part, by everything they had subsequently read and heard about Roswell. This is not a moral failing, it is simply how human memory works. But it does mean that sincerity is not the same as accuracy, and that a witness who genuinely believes what they're saying may still be describing something that has been significantly altered by the passage of time. With that in mind, some of the specific witness accounts are still worth looking at carefully, because they involve people with direct connections to the events and accounts that predate much of the later cultural noise. Loretta Proctor was a neighbour of Mac Brazel, living on a ranch adjacent to the Foster property. She was one of the people Brazel showed the debris to before he went to town to report it. In interviews conducted years later, she described the material as unlike anything she had seen. A piece of what she called unusual foil, and a small beam or stick that could not be cut with a knife. She was not a dramatic witness. She did not claim to have seen bodies or spacecraft. She described a specific, limited experience in matter-of-fact terms, and her account was consistent across multiple interviews over the years. That kind of consistency is meaningful, though it does not tell us what the material actually was. Bill Brezel Jr., Mac Brezel's son, was a rancher himself by the time researchers found him. He described finding additional pieces of the debris in the weeks after the military had cleaned up the field, small fragments that he had collected and kept until, he said, military personnel came to the ranch and took them from him. He described the material in terms similar to his father and to Loretta Proctor, an unusual foil-like substance that would not tear or crease in the way ordinary foil would. His account is interesting partly because it suggests the cleanup was not entirely complete, and partly because it comes from someone who had no particular stake in the UFO question and seemed genuinely reluctant to be drawn into the larger controversy around the case. Frank Joyce was a young radio reporter in Roswell in July 1947, working at KGFL. He spoke to Mac Brezel by phone before Brezel went to the base, and then again after Brezel had been held at the base for several days. Joyce claimed that in the first conversation, Brezel described something that sounded genuinely strange and anomalous, and that in the second conversation, after his time with the military, Brezel was noticeably different, more guarded, repeating the weather balloon explanation in a way that Joyce felt did not reflect what Brezel had actually told him earlier. Joyce's account has been disputed, and his recollections of the specific content of those conversations have shifted somewhat over the years. But the basic shape of it, a witness who changed his story after extended contact with the military, is consistent with what other people observed about Brezel's behaviour in July 1947. Mac Brezel himself died in 1963, before the modern investigation really began, so he was never interviewed by the researchers who did most of this work. What survives of his account comes from the 1947 newspaper interviews, from the recollections of people who knew him, and from the brief period after the incident when he spoke publicly. Those sources suggest a man who was uncomfortable with the attention the story brought him, who told neighbours he wished he had never found anything, and who seemed to feel that his cooperation with the military had cost him something, though exactly what is hard to say at this distance. The problem that runs through all of this testimony, and the researchers who gathered it were aware of it to varying degrees, is that you cannot cleanly separate genuine recollection from cultural influence after this much time has passed. By the late 1980s and 1990s, Roswell was already a major cultural phenomenon. People in the area had been hearing about it for years. The story had been in books and documentaries and newspaper retrospectives. When a researcher arrived to interview a witness, that witness had almost certainly already encountered some version of the Roswell narrative, and that encounter would inevitably have influenced how they framed and recalled their own experiences. This does not mean their accounts are worthless. It means they have to be handled carefully, and that the most reliable elements are probably the ones that are specific, consistent across time, and not easily explained by cultural contamination. What the civilian investigation did establish fairly convincingly was that the official 1947 weather balloon explanation was inadequate. The number of people who describe material inconsistent with a standard Raywin target device, and the consistency of certain specific details across independent accounts, made it genuinely difficult to accept that Brezel had simply found a downed weather balloon, and that all the subsequent confusion was a misunderstanding. The Mogul explanation, which came later, was more credible than the weather balloon story. But even Mogul left open questions that the civilian researchers documented in some detail. What the civilian investigation did not establish, and this is where honest accounting requires some care, was what actually happened. The volume of testimony is not the same as verified evidence. 100 people describing something anomalous in general terms does not constitute proof of any specific claim about what that anomalous thing was. And the civilian investigation, for all its scale and effort, was never able to produce physical evidence, a piece of material, a document, a photograph, that could be independently examined and confirmed as inconsistent with known technology. Everything rested on testimony, and testimony, however sincere, has limits. There were also specific witnesses whose accounts the civilian investigation leaned on heavily, and who later turned out to be unreliable. Frank Kaufman was one of the most prominent. He claimed to have been part of a special military team that recovered a craft and bodies, and he provided detailed, vivid accounts that researchers found compelling for years. After his death in 2001, researchers examining his papers found evidence that he had fabricated significant portions of his story, including documents he had apparently forged. The Kaufman case was a blow to the investigation, not because it disproved anything else, but because it illustrated how difficult it was to distinguish genuine witnesses from people who had constructed narratives for their own reasons: attention, belief, a desire to be part of something significant. Glenn Dennis, the mortician whose account was one of the more widely cited pieces of testimony about bodies, also ran into credibility problems. His account of the nurse who described non-human bodies to him was a central piece of the body narrative, but researchers were never able to identify the nurse or confirm her existence. Dennis gave different names for her at different times, and attempts to locate military nursing records from the period that might have identified her came up empty. Dennis maintained his account, but its unverifiable core made it difficult to build anything solid on top of it. None of this means the entire civilian investigation was without value. The researchers who worked on Roswell through the 1980s and 1990s did document the inadequacy of the 1947 explanation, did locate witnesses who had genuine connections to the events, and did force a more serious public and governmental engagement with the case than would otherwise have happened. The 1994 GAO investigation was, in part, a response to the pressure generated by civilian researchers and by Congressman Schiff's constituents in New Mexico. The Air Force reports of 1994 and 1997, whatever their limitations, represented a more substantial official engagement with the evidence than anything that had come before. In that sense, the civilian investigation accomplished something real, even if it fell short of the definitive answers it was seeking. The deeper difficulty, and this is something the more thoughtful researchers in the field acknowledged, is that Roswell may simply not be resolvable at the level of certainty that would satisfy a skeptic or confirm a believer. The events happened in 1947. The key witnesses are dead. The physical material, whatever it was, is gone. The records that might have clarified the military's internal response were, as the GAO found, missing. What remains is a collection of testimonies, official documents, and explanations that do not quite fit together neatly, regardless of which framework you use to interpret them. That is an uncomfortable place to be, intellectually, but it may be the most honest place available. By the late 1990s, the civilian investigation had produced an enormous body of material: books, interviews, databases, conference presentations, and had also produced something it had not entirely anticipated: its own mythology. The longer the investigation went on, and the more famous Roswell became, the harder it became to do careful, grounded work on the case. New witnesses appeared, who seemed shaped by the story as much as by personal experience. Old accounts were revised in ways that made them more dramatic. The signal-to-noise ratio, never great to begin with, got worse as the cultural moment around Roswell intensified. Through the mid-1990s, the investigation was, in some ways, a victim of the very attention it had helped generate, and yet, sitting with all of it, the credible witnesses and the fabricated ones, the consistent details and the contaminated memories, the serious researchers and the opportunists, what you're left with is a case that genuinely resists simple dismissal. The civilian investigation at its best preserved accounts and documented inconsistencies that would otherwise have been lost. It kept a question open that deserved to stay open, even if it could not answer that question. And some of what it found, the testimony of people like Loretta Proctor and Bill Brazel Jr., the documented behaviour of Mac Brazel after his time at the base, the specific details that recurred across independent accounts, points towards something that happened in the summer of 1947 that was not entirely what the military said it was. What that something was is a question the civilian investigation never answered. But it was not, for the most part, asking the only question that mattered. There was another piece of the puzzle, quieter, more personal, and in some ways more unsettling than anything the researchers had uncovered through their years of interviews and records requests. It came from inside the story itself, from one of the original participants, and it was sealed away for years, waiting. Walter Haut was 76 years old when he sat down to record what he said was the truth. Not a partial truth, not the version he had given in interviews over the decades, not the careful, hedged account he had offered publicly since the story resurfaced in the late 1970s. The full truth, as he understood it. He put it into a sworn affidavit in 2002, signed it, had it notarized, and then asked that it be sealed until after his death. He died in December 2005. The affidavit was released in 2007. What it said was not what most people expected from Walter Haut. Haut was, in a sense, the most official civilian face of the Roswell story. He was the man who wrote the press release. On July 8th, 1947, it was Haut who typed out the words stating that the army had recovered a flying disc, and it was Haut who distributed that statement to the local radio stations and newspapers. He was a first lieutenant at the time, 23 years old, recently returned from the Pacific where he had served as a bombardier. He was the public information officer at Roswell Army Airfield, and writing press releases was his job. He did what he was told. He issued the statement. Then, hours later, the story changed, and Haut went along with that too. For decades afterward, Haut said publicly that he had simply done his job. He had issued the press release because Colonel Blanchard told him to, and he had not personally seen any debris or any craft or anything else. He was the messenger, not the witness. That was the story he told in interviews through the 1980s and 1990s, and it was a reasonable story. It fit the timeline. It fit his role. It was the kind of account that made sense for a junior officer following orders in a chain of command. The 2002 affidavit told a different story entirely. In the affidavit, Haut stated that on the morning of July 8th, 1947, he attended a staff meeting at the base with Colonel Blanchard and other senior officers. He stated that at that meeting, Blanchard briefed those present on 2 crash sites, not one. The debris field on the Foster Ranch that Mac Brazel had reported was one. The second, Haut said, was a site closer to Roswell, where a more intact craft had been found. He stated that after the meeting, Blanchard personally took him to Hangar 84 on the base, and that inside the hangar he saw the craft itself, oval-shaped, perhaps 15 feet in length, and near it 2 bodies, small bodies, with large heads, non-human. He stated that the press release he was instructed to issue was a deliberate distraction. The announcement of a recovered flying disc was designed to get ahead of the story in a controlled way, and the rapid retraction was designed to close it down before anyone looked too closely. The weather balloon explanation, in Haut's account, was cover. The real material was somewhere else entirely. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because the affidavit is not a casual claim. Haut went to some trouble to ensure it would be taken seriously. He chose the sealed format specifically so it could not be used during his lifetime, could not be subjected to the kind of public pressure that had shaped other witnesses' accounts over the years, and would stand as a final statement rather than an opening for debate. He signed it. He had it witnessed. He clearly intended it to be his last word on the subject. And yet, the affidavit was written 55 years after the events it describes. Haut was 76 years old and in declining health. Memory at that distance, even for a person of good faith and sharp mind, is not the same thing as a recording. It is reconstructed, shaped by everything that has happened in the intervening decades, by the books read, the interviews given, the conversations had, the documentary watched, the stories absorbed. Haut had been deeply involved in the Roswell story for years. He was one of the 3 co-founders of the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell, which opened in 1991. He had spent years in that environment, surrounded by the testimony of other witnesses, the theories of researchers, the artifacts and displays and narratives that the museum presented to the public. He had, in other words, been immersed in the Roswell story for a very long time before he wrote the affidavit. That does not mean he invented what he described. It means that separating what he personally experienced in July 1947 from what he came to believe happened in July 1947, after decades of immersion in the case, is genuinely impossible. Memory does not work like a file cabinet. It works more like a document that gets slightly rewritten every time it is opened. Over 55 years, opened thousands of times, a memory can drift considerably from its original form without the person experiencing that drift being aware of it. There is also the question of what Haut said before the affidavit. In a 2000 interview, just 2 years before signing the affidavit, Haut was asked directly whether he had seen any debris or craft or bodies. He said he had not. He said he had simply issued the press release as instructed, and had no personal knowledge beyond that. 2 years later, he signed a document saying he had personally seen a craft and bodies in Hangar 84. That is not a small discrepancy. That is a fundamental reversal on the central question. And because Haut died in 2005, there is no way to ask him about it. No cross-examination, no follow-up, no chance to understand what changed between 2000 and 2002, or whether something changed at all, or whether the 2000 interview was itself the incomplete version. The International UFO Museum and Research Centre is worth mentioning in its own right, because it tells you something about how Roswell had evolved by the time Haut signed his affidavit. The museum sits on Main Street in downtown Roswell, in a building that used to be a movie theatre. It opened in 1991, co-founded by Haut, Max Little, and Glenn Dennis, the mortician whose testimony about child-sized caskets and preserved bodies was already a central part of the civilian investigation. The museum draws visitors from around the world. By the early 2000s, it was receiving well over 100,000 visitors a year. It houses exhibits on the 1947 incident, on UFO sightings more broadly, on alien culture as represented in film and popular media. There are alien mannequins. There are replica crash sites. There is a gift shop. It is, depending on your perspective, either a serious research institution housed in a tourist-friendly format, or a tourist attraction that has gradually absorbed the serious research. Probably it is some of both. The point is that Haut was not a detached observer by 2002. He was one of the founders of an institution whose existence depended, at least in part, on the significance of the Roswell story. That does not make him a liar. People can be both commercially invested in a story and genuinely convinced of its truth. But it is a factor worth noting when assessing the affidavit, because it adds a layer of complexity to the question of what motivated the document and what it represents. What the affidavit does, even setting aside the question of its literal accuracy, is crystallize something that had been building in the Roswell case for decades. The most official insider, the man whose name was on the press release, the man who was there, the man who was part of the institutional response in real time, said at the end of his life that what happened was not what the military said happened. That statement carries a certain weight regardless of its verifiability. It represents a judgment made by someone who was present that the official story was false, and Haut was not alone in that judgment among the people who were actually at RAAF in July 1947. Jesse Marcel had said much the same thing since 1978. Colonel Blanchard, who authorised the original press release, died in 1966 and left no known statement about the events. General Ramey, who issued the weather balloon correction, died in 1963. The chain of command that managed the story in real time is gone. What remains are the accounts of the people further down that chain, Marcel, Haut, and others, and those accounts, taken together, suggest that at least some of the people involved did not believe the official explanation. That is not the same as saying the official explanation is wrong. People can disbelieve a true explanation, especially if they were not given full information about what the explanation actually was. If the debris was from Project Mogul, and if that program was classified at a level above Marcel's clearance, then Marcel might genuinely not have been told what he was looking at. his disbelief would be sincere and also consistent with Mogul being the correct answer. The same logic could apply to Haut, who as a junior public information officer would not necessarily have been read into a classified balloon program. What they believed and what actually happened are not required to be the same thing. This is one of the more quietly frustrating aspects of the Roswell case. The evidence that something unusual happened are the press release, the rapid retraction, the witness testimony, the missing records, is real. The question of what that unusual thing was remains genuinely open, and the most dramatic claims, the ones about craft and bodies, rest on sources that are either unverifiable, internally contradictory, or complicated by time and circumstance in ways that make certainty impossible. The Haut affidavit is the sharpest example of this. It is the most dramatic insider account in the entire case. It comes from the man whose signature is on the document that started everything. It was sealed and released posthumously in a format designed to maximize its credibility and minimize the possibility of retraction, and yet it cannot be verified, cannot be cross-examined, contradicts Haut's own earlier statements, and was produced 55 years after the events it describes by a man who had spent over a decade deeply immersed in the Roswell story as a co-founder of a museum dedicated to it. You can find that combination compelling, or you can find it disqualifying. Most people, depending on where they started, will find it confirms what they already suspected. That is perhaps the most honest thing to say about the affidavit. It does not resolve anything. It adds a layer. It raises the temperature slightly. It gives the case one more piece that does not fit cleanly into any framework. What it does not do is close the question. If anything, the release of the affidavit in 2007 reopened debates that had quieted somewhat in the years after the Air Force reports of 1994 and 1997. Researchers who had been skeptical of the body accounts found new reason to look again. Researchers who had always believed found what felt like confirmation. The broader public, encountering the story through news coverage of the affidavit's release, got another round of headlines about Roswell. Another moment where the case surfaced, generated attention, and then receded again without resolution. There is something almost structural about that pattern. Roswell surfaces, generates heat, and then goes quiet again, never quite resolved and never quite dismissed. The affidavit is part of that rhythm. It arrived, made its claim, and settled into the long accumulation of contested evidence that defines the case. What Walter Haut believed, at the end of his life, seems clear enough from the document he left behind. Whether what he believed was an accurate memory of what he witnessed in July 1947, or a sincere conviction shaped by decades of immersion in a story that had grown far beyond its origins, that is a question that cannot be answered now. He is gone. The hangar he described is gone, or at least whatever it contained is long gone. The summer of 1947 is beyond the reach of any investigation, but the affidavit exists. It is a real document, signed by a real man who was genuinely present at Roswell Army Airfield in July 1947. Whatever its limitations, it represents something, a person who was there, who carried the story for 58 years, and who decided at the end that he did not want to take a different version of it with him. Whether that decision reflected courage, conviction, memory, or something more complicated is the kind of question that the Roswell case tends to leave you with, not answered, but worth holding. And the story did not stop there. Because even as the witnesses aged and the affidavits accumulated and the researchers debated, something else was happening to Roswell entirely. Something that would change the case in a different way, not by adding evidence, but by surrounding the original events with so much noise that the signal became harder to find than ever. The town itself had transformed. The story had become something larger than any single witness account or government report could contain. And understanding what Roswell became and how it got there is part of understanding why the question of what actually happened in 1947 is so difficult to answer clearly today. There is a version of Roswell that exists almost entirely apart from the events of July 1947. It has its own geography, its own calendar, its own economy. It has a museum on North Main Street where you can buy alien plush toys and read reproductions of the original press release behind glass. It has a festival every summer where people dress in green body paint and antennae and walk through a downtown that is fully committed to the bit. It has restaurants with alien-themed names and motels with flying saucer logos and a water tower that was repainted to look like a UFO sometime in the 1990s, during the decade when Roswell went from being a regional curiosity to a full-scale American myth. The population of Roswell today sits at around 48,000 people. The International UFO Museum and Research Center, which opened in 1991 and which Walter Haut helped co-found, draws somewhere in the range of 180,000 visitors per year. The annual UFO festival, held each summer around the anniversary of the incident, brings in tens of thousands more. Families, enthusiasts, skeptics, true believers, and people who are just there because it seemed like an interesting road trip. By any measure, Roswell is a success story of a particular American kind. A small city that took the strangest thing that ever happened near it and built something durable out of the uncertainty. But there is a cost to that, and it is worth thinking about carefully. The transformation did not happen all at once. Through most of the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s, Roswell was not especially famous for the 1947 incident. The story had been officially closed within days of the press release. Most of the country had moved on. The town was known for its agricultural economy, its oil production, its proximity to Carlsbad caverns. The crash, such as it was, had receded into the background of local memory, something some people knew about, something a few old-timers mentioned, but not the defining fact of the place. That began to change in 1978, when Stanton Friedman interviewed Jesse Marcel, and the story found its way back into public circulation. Then, in 1980, the Roswell incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore put the case in front of a general readership. Interest grew through the 1980s, slowly at first. Researchers began visiting, interviewing witnesses, publishing books. By the early 1990s, Roswell had enough momentum as a UFO story that the town began to see an opportunity, and the museum opened. Then came the 1990s proper, and things accelerated in ways that were probably impossible to predict or control. In 1994, the same year the Air Force released its Project Mogul report, Showtime aired a television film simply called Roswell. It starred Kyle MacLachlan as Jesse Marcel, and was based on a book by Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt. It was a serious, relatively restrained dramatization, not a monster movie, not a comedy, and it reached a large audience. That same year, the GAO investigation was generating news coverage. The Air Force report was generating news coverage. Roswell was in the air in a way it had not been since 1947. Then, in 1995, a British media producer named Ray Santilli released footage he claimed was authentic film of an alien autopsy conducted after the Roswell crash. The footage showed a grainy black and white examination of a strange humanoid figure on a surgical table, surrounded by figures in protective suits. It was broadcast in the United States on Fox under the title Alien Autopsy, Fact or Fiction, and was watched by an enormous television audience. Researchers immediately raised serious doubts about its authenticity. The footage looked wrong in multiple ways: the surgical techniques, the equipment, the body itself. But it was on television, on a major network, and it lodged itself in the public imagination with a force that careful debunking rarely matches. Santilli eventually admitted, in 2006, that the footage was largely a reconstruction. A recreation he and a colleague had produced because the original film he claimed to possess had deteriorated. He maintained there was an original, but that claim has never been substantiated. The Alien Autopsy film is now generally understood to be a fabrication, or at best a highly embellished reconstruction of something that may or may not have ever existed. But for the decade between 1995 and 2006, it circulated as a contested piece of evidence, and its imagery, the pale, large-headed figure on the table, became one of the most recognisable images associated with Roswell in popular culture. In 1996, Independence Day was released in theatres and became one of the highest-grossing films of the year. It featured a scene set explicitly at Area 51 involving recovered alien craft and bodies, with a direct nod to Roswell as the source of the recovered technology. The film was not about Roswell, but it absorbed Roswell into its mythology, and for millions of viewers it was probably their first encounter with the idea in any form. The fictional version arrived before the factual version for an entire generation of people. This is not a small problem for anyone trying to understand what actually happened in New Mexico in 1947. When a story becomes this culturally saturated, when it has its own film, its own television special, its own blockbuster cameo, its own museum, its own festival, its own merchandise, the original events begin to function differently in the public mind. They become less like a historical incident and more like a founding myth. And founding myths are not really about what happened. They're about what the story means. They're about the feelings the story carries, the sense of government secrecy, the possibility of contact, the idea that we are not alone, and that someone in authority knows it and has been hiding it for decades. Those feelings are real and understandable, but they are not the same as evidence, and the cultural machinery that generates them does not distinguish carefully between the two. What this meant for serious investigation of the 1947 events was, in practical terms, quite damaging. By the mid-1990s, the signal-to-noise ratio had become genuinely difficult to manage. New witnesses were coming forward, but it was nearly impossible to know whether their accounts were genuine memories from 1947 or stories shaped by decades of exposure to the Roswell narrative in its many cultural forms. People who had been children in Roswell in 1947 were now in their 60s and 70s. They had lived through the original events, yes, but they had also lived through 30 or 40 years of a story that had grown and changed and accumulated detail with every retelling. Memory does not work like a recording. It reconstructs, and it reconstructs using whatever material is available, including things seen on television and read in books and heard from neighbours. This is not an accusation against any particular witness. It is just how human memory functions under conditions of long exposure to a narrative. The researchers who interviewed witnesses in the 1980s and 1990s were often aware of this problem, and the better ones tried to account for it. But accounting for memory contamination is easier said than done, especially when you are also genuinely trying to find out what happened, and part of you wants the witnesses to remember something significant. The sheer volume of witness accounts that accumulated through this period is striking. Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt, in their 1991 book UFO Crash at Roswell, reported having interviewed over 200 people with some connection to the events or the community. 200 is a lot, but quantity is not the same as reliability, and many of the accounts they gathered were second or third hand. People who had heard something from someone who had worked at the base, or whose uncle had told them something in the 1950s, or who remembered a conversation that may or may not have happened the way they remembered it. The accounts that carry the most weight are still the ones closest to the original events. Marcel's testimony, Brazel's original report to the sheriff, the press release itself, the photographs taken in Ramey's office. Those are the anchors. Everything built on top of them has to be evaluated against how far it sits from that core and how many steps of time and telling and cultural influence separate it from July 1947. What the tourism and the entertainment industry did, more than anything else, was make it very hard to hold that distinction clearly. When Roswell is a festival and a museum and a Fox television special and a scene in a summer blockbuster, the July 1947 events become one layer among many, and not necessarily the most vivid layer for most people. The alien autopsy footage, fake as it was more visceral and immediate than any written account of Mac Brazel finding debris on a ranch. The festival is more fun than reading a GAO report. The culture wins the attention war almost every time. There is a version of this you could read as simply how things go. Stories become myths. Myths generate culture. Culture generates money. And somewhere underneath all of it, the original events continue to exist, waiting for anyone patient enough to dig through the layers. That's probably the most accurate way to describe the situation. Roswell the myth and Roswell the historical incident coexist, but they do not always support each other. Sometimes the myth actively obscures the incident by making it harder to take seriously, by associating it with fabricated footage and costume festivals and novelty merchandise, by turning the question of what happened into something that feels more like entertainment than inquiry. And there is a particular irony in the fact that Walter Haut, the man who wrote the press release that started everything, spent his later years running a museum dedicated to the story that press release created. He was there at the beginning, and he was there at the commercialization. He co-founded the International UFO Museum in 1991, gave interviews, participated in the growing Roswell industry, and then, in 2002, gave that sealed affidavit claiming to have seen things that went far beyond what he had ever said publicly. It is difficult to know how to weigh those two things against each other. The public figure who helped build the myth, and the private statement made at the end of a life. The festival itself is worth pausing on for a moment, not to mock it, because there is something genuinely warm about it. People who love a mystery gathering in the desert to celebrate the uncertainty together. There is a costume contest. There are lectures by researchers. There are vendors selling crystals and books and t-shirts. There are children running around with antenna headbands. It is, by all accounts, a good time. And it happens every year in a town that, without the 1947 incident and everything that grew from it, would be a fairly ordinary small city in southeastern New Mexico. The story gave Roswell something. That is real. But the festival is also, in a quiet way, a monument to irresolution. It happens because the question was never answered. If the Air Force had produced a completely convincing explanation in 1947, or in 1994, or in 1997, one that accounted for every witness account and left no gaps, there would be no festival. The festival exists because the case is still open in the minds of enough people to be worth celebrating. The uncertainty is the product. The mystery is the attraction. Which means there is, somewhere in the machinery of Roswell tourism, a structural incentive for the mystery to remain a mystery. No one is necessarily engineering that. It is just the shape of things. This does not mean the mystery is fake. The genuine questions about what happened in July 1947 are real, and they exist independently of the tourism economy and the entertainment industry. The missing RAAF records are real. Jesse Marcel's testimony is real. The press release is real. The rapid retraction is real. None of those things were invented by the festival or the museum or Ray Santilli's alien autopsy footage. They were there before all of that, and they remain after it. But the cultural weight that has accumulated around those real questions makes it harder to approach them with clear eyes. A person coming to Roswell for the first time in 2024, whether through a documentary, a festival visit, a Wikipedia article, or a YouTube video, is not encountering the raw events of 1947. They are encountering a story that has been told and retold and dramatized and debated and commercialized for nearly 80 years. The original signal is still in there. It is just surrounded by an enormous amount of everything else. And this is, in a way, the final thing that Roswell became. Not just a mystery and not just a tourist destination, but a kind of cultural pressure test. A place where questions about government transparency, about institutional trust, about the reliability of official explanations, and about the human capacity for self-deception, both individual and collective, all converge. The UFO question is in some ways the smallest part of what Roswell actually asks. The larger questions are about how we handle uncertainty, how institutions manage information in the name of security, how stories grow beyond their origins, and how difficult it is to find the truth of a thing once enough time and enough noise have accumulated around it. Those questions do not have tidy answers. They did not in 1947, and they do not now. but they are worth sitting with, which is perhaps why Roswell keeps coming back, surfacing every few years with a new document or a new account or a new generation of people encountering the story for the first time and finding, to their mild surprise, that it is more complicated and more interesting than the alien merchandise suggested. The myth is one thing. What lies underneath it is something else entirely, and it is to that something, to what can actually be known, and what cannot, and why that distinction matters more than the answer itself, that the story finally turns. So let us try to set aside for a moment everything that Roswell became. The costumes, the museum, the films, the affidavits sealed and then opened, the researchers and the debunkers and the television specials. Let us try to go back to what can actually be said with some confidence about what happened in July 1947, and then look honestly at what cannot. Something fell on the Foster Ranch. That is not in dispute. McBrazel found a debris field large enough and strange enough that he felt it was worth reporting to the sheriff, and he was a working rancher who had presumably seen plenty of ordinary things fall on his land over the years. He waited a few days, which suggests he was not immediately certain what he was looking at, but eventually he drove into Roswell and described what he had found to George Wilcox. Wilcox took it seriously enough to call the base. The base sent Major Jesse Marcel, an experienced intelligence officer, who drove out to the ranch, spent a night there, examined the material and collected samples. Marcel took those samples seriously enough to stop at his own home on the way back to show his wife and young son. That is a small detail, but it is a human one. He wanted them to see it. Whatever it was, it struck him as worth showing. Then, on July 8th, Lieutenant Walter Haut issued a press release under the authorization of Colonel William Blanchard, stating that the Army had recovered a flying disc. That press release went out on the AP wire. Newspapers across the country ran the headline, and then, within hours, General Roger Ramey in Fort Worth held a press conference, showed photographs of Marcel with what he identified as a Rowan weather balloon and radar reflector, and closed the story. House press release was retracted. The flying disc became a balloon. The newspapers moved on within days. Those are the documented events. They are not in serious dispute. What is in dispute is what they mean. The most credible explanation for the debris, the one supported by documentary evidence and by the testimony of people who actually worked on the program, is Project Mogul. The Air Force's 1994 report made this case carefully. Mogul was a classified program designed to use high-altitude balloon trains to detect Soviet nuclear tests acoustically. The balloon trains were enormous, sometimes stretching 600 feet, carrying radar reflectors made of foil and balsa wood, along with acoustic sensors. Flight number 4, launched from Alamogordo in early June 1947, was lost, and its projected flight path was consistent with the Foster Ranch debris field. Physicist Charles Moore, who worked on Mogul and was still alive when the 1994 report was prepared, supported this explanation and provided technical details that matched descriptions of the debris. The unusual materials, the foil that seemed to return to its shape, the beams with markings, the lightweight but tough construction, are consistent with what a Mogul balloon train would have looked like to someone who had never seen one. And because Mogul was classified, the military's reluctance to explain what it actually was makes straightforward sense. You do not announce a classified acoustic surveillance program in the middle of a press conference, even if it would resolve an embarrassing headline about flying discs. This is a reasonable explanation. It fits the available evidence. It does not require unusual assumptions, and it is worth saying clearly. For the debris field on the Foster Ranch, Project Mogul remains the most plausible answer we have. But Mogul does not explain everything. It does not explain the press release itself, why Colonel Blanchard authorized Haut to use the phrase flying disc in an official statement if the material was simply a weather balloon, or even a classified balloon program. A classified program would have argued for silence, not for a dramatic public announcement followed immediately by a retraction. The sequence is odd. Issue a startling claim, then take it back within hours. If the goal was to suppress information, announcing a flying disc first seems like a strange way to go about it. Some researchers have suggested that the announcement was a mistake, that Blanchard acted before consulting Ramey, and that Ramey's press conference was damage control. That is possible. It is also possible that the announcement was deliberate misdirection of some kind, though for what purpose is harder to say. What is clear is that the sequence of events on July 8th, 1947, has never been fully explained in a way that accounts for all of its steps. There is also the matter of the missing records. When the GAO conducted its investigation at Congressman Stephen Schiff's request in 1994, it found that the outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield for the period covering July and August 1947 were missing. Not classified, not restricted, missing. The GAO noted that the destruction of these records was not in accordance with existing regulations. That is a careful, bureaucratic way of saying that records that should have existed and should have been preserved were not there. The GAO did not conclude what this meant. It simply noted the absence. But it is a real absence, and it is the kind of detail that is difficult to fit neatly into any explanation, including the mogul explanation. Jesse Marcel's testimony is another thing that sits uneasily. Marcel was the intelligence officer of the 509th Bomb Group, the only atomic-capable unit in the world at that time. He was not an inexperienced observer. He had handled military equipment, including weather balloons and radar reflectors. When Stanton Friedman interviewed him in 1978, Marcel said clearly that the material he collected at the Foster Ranch was not a weather balloon, and that the debris photographed in Ramey's office in Fort Worth was not the material he had brought from the ranch. He said this calmly, without drama, as a retired officer describing something he remembered. His son, Jesse Marcel Jr., who became a physician and later served as a military flight surgeon, told the same story for the rest of his life, that as a 12-year-old boy he had held pieces of material brought home by his father, and that the material was unlike anything he had encountered before or since. Jesse Marcel Jr. died in 2013. He never changed his account. Neither of these testimonies can be independently verified. Marcel Sr. died in 1986, and whatever he knew or believed went with him. Memory is not a recording, and the fact that someone is sincere does not mean they are accurate. It is genuinely possible that Marcel misidentified mogul debris as something more exotic, that the unusual appearance of the materials led him to conclusions that were not correct. It is possible. But his specific claim that the material in Ramey's photographs was not the same material he had collected is harder to dismiss as simple misidentification. That is a claim about substitution, not about perception. The body accounts are a different matter, and they need to be treated differently. Glenn Dennis, the mortician who claimed he received calls from RAAF about child-sized caskets and spoke to a nurse who described non-human remains, gave an account that was never corroborated. The nurse he described could not be identified. His story changed in certain details over the years. Frank Kaufman, who claimed first-hand knowledge of a second crash site and recovered bodies, was later found to have fabricated documents supporting his account. Grady Barnett's story of a crash on the plains of San Agustin was second-hand, reported by people who said Barnett had told them, not by Barnett himself, who died in 1969. The Air Force's 1997 report suggested that body accounts might be explained by memories of crash test dummies used in Project High Dive from 1954 onward, though critics rightly pointed out that 1954 is 7 years after 1947, and it is difficult to explain how memories from one decade contaminate recollections of a different decade. The body accounts are the part of the Roswell story that carries the most cultural weight and the least evidentiary support. They are what transformed a debris recovery story into something larger, and it is worth being honest about the fact that the witnesses who describe bodies were, in most cases, not present at the original events, or gave accounts that were significantly altered over time, or were later shown to have fabricated supporting materials. This does not mean nothing unusual happened. It means the body accounts specifically cannot be used as reliable evidence of what that unusual thing was. Walter Haut's sealed affidavit, the statement he gave in 2002, and asked to be opened after his death, which came in 2005 and which was released in 2007, claimed that he personally saw a craft and non-human bodies at Hangar 84 on the RAAF base. This is the most dramatic insider account in the entire Roswell record. It is also the most difficult to evaluate. Haut was 80 years old when he gave the affidavit. He was writing about events that had occurred 55 years earlier. He had spent more than a decade co-running the International UFO Museum, surrounded by the Roswell story and the people who believed in it most deeply. His earlier public statements had not included claims about seeing a craft or bodies. The affidavit cannot be cross-examined. Haut cannot be asked why this account differed from what he had said before, or what prompted him to include details in 2002 that he had not mentioned in the previous 5 decades. It is possible that the affidavit represents a genuine final disclosure of something he had kept private. It is also possible that it represents the accumulated weight of years spent inside a story, a mind shaped by decades of immersion in accounts and beliefs that eventually merged with memory. Both possibilities are real. Neither can be ruled out. What all of this leaves us with is a case that is genuinely unresolved at its edges, even if its centre, the debris, the ranch, the balloon program explanation, is reasonably well understood. The missing records are a real gap. The press release and retraction sequence is a real anomaly. Marcel's testimony is a real complication. And the fact that the Air Force's own follow-up reports introduced new inconsistencies, particularly the time gap between the 1947 events and the 1954 dummy drops, means that even the official closing of the case left threads loose. This is, in a quiet way, what makes Roswell worth taking seriously as a historical event, separate from all the mythology. It is a case where the official explanations are plausible but incomplete, where the witness testimony is compelling but unverifiable, and where the documentary record has a specific and documented gap at exactly the moment when it would matter most. That combination, plausible explanation, unverifiable testimony, missing records, is not proof of anything extraordinary, but it is a legitimate reason for the case to remain open as a historical question. There is something else worth saying, though, something that sits underneath the specific details of debris fields and press releases and affidavits. Roswell matters because of what it revealed about the relationship between institutions and the people they serve. In 1947, the military issued a statement and retracted it within hours, and the public largely accepted the retraction without much follow-up. The culture of that moment, shaped by wartime deference to military authority, by the newness of the Cold War, by the genuine need for secrecy around programs like Mogul, made that acceptance reasonable. People trusted the institutions, or at least accepted that the institutions had information they could not share. That trust was not irrational. It was the product of a specific historical moment. But the decades that followed eroded that trust in ways that made the Roswell retraction look different in retrospect. Revelations about other government programs, about experiments conducted without public knowledge, about operations that were later admitted and apologized for, created a context in which a military retraction issued within hours of an extraordinary claim looked less like routine correction and more like something worth questioning. Roswell did not cause that erosion of trust, but it became a focal point for it, a place where the question of whether official explanations could be taken at face value felt concrete and specific rather than abstract. This is why the story keeps coming back. Not because the evidence for extraordinary events is overwhelming, it is not, but because the case sits at the intersection of several things that people care about deeply. What governments know and do not disclose, whether official explanations are complete or strategic, what happens to truth when secrecy and time and cultural accumulation all press against it from different directions. These are not fringe concerns. They are legitimate questions about how democratic societies manage information, and Roswell is one of the places where those questions became attached to a specific set of events that could be examined, argued over, and returned to. The town of Roswell is still there, of course. The Foster Ranch is still out there in the high desert, 75 miles north. quiet and dry and mostly unchanged from what it was in 1947. The debris field is long gone, cleared away in the days after Brazel's discovery. There is nothing to see, but the place exists, and on a clear night the sky above it is the same sky it has always been, wide and dark and full of things that are very far away. Mac Brazel never quite recovered from the attention his discovery brought him. Neighbours later said he seemed changed after his time with the military following the incident, quieter, less willing to talk about what he had found. He told a reporter in July 1947 that he hoped he never found another flying disc. He died in 1963, without ever giving a detailed public account of what he had seen on that morning, in the summer of 1947, when he rode out to check on his sheep and found something in the scrub that did not belong there. Whatever it was, it fell. It was found, it was collected, a press release was written, and then taken back. Photographs were taken of a man in an office in Fort Worth, kneeling beside material that may or may not have been what was recovered. Records were destroyed or lost. Witnesses gave accounts that were sincere and contradictory and impossible to fully verify. Reports were written, museums were built, festivals were held. And the question, the original simple question of what fell on that ranch on a stormy night in early July 1947, was never answered in a way that everyone could accept. Maybe that is the most honest thing that can be said about Roswell. Not that it proves something extraordinary happened, and not that it proves nothing unusual occurred, but that it is a case where the answer, whatever it was, did not survive the decades intact. The records that might have settled it are gone. The witnesses who might have clarified it are gone. What remains is a partial picture, with specific and documented gaps, surrounded by an enormous amount of story. And there is something in that, something worth sitting with quietly. The gap between what happened and what we can know about what happened is real, and it is not always filled by extraordinary explanations. Sometimes it is filled by ordinary things: classification, bureaucracy, the passage of time, the fallibility of memory, the tendency of stories to grow in the telling. Sometimes the most honest answer is that we do not know, and that not knowing is not the same as the answer being unknowable. It just means the evidence we needed did not make it to us. Roswell keeps asking its question, and the question, at its quietest and most serious, is simply this: what do you do with a story where the truth was present once, and then the conditions for knowing it were gradually and perhaps irreversibly lost? There is no clean answer to that. There probably never will be. But it is worth asking on a quiet night, with the desert somewhere out there in the dark, and the sky above it open and patient and very, very old. Thank you for spending this time here. Wherever you are listening from tonight, I hope it is somewhere comfortable, and I hope the story was worth the hours. Take care of yourselves, and we will see you next time.